Kia mā taratara whakatai. He aki ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, he hei mauri ora. A karakia to start off our mahi today, acknowledging the four winds, and to centre our kaupapa. And it's very apt to have this karakia with the ngā hau e whā. It's acknowledged here in this meeting room. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Roz, and welcome everyone to this hearing. Shortly do our introductions, but I'm chairing this hearing, Gary Ray, and shortly introduce ourselves. This hearing by RW Cromwell Limited for the Wooing Tree Avenue site. I think everyone in the room is well familiar with what the focus of the hearing is. Just like to welcome everybody to the hearing. Now, we go further, health and safety. I understand that the procedure is to, in the event of an emergency, is to exit these doors and to go out into the area behind me. Is that right, Darren? That courtyard area behind us, so that's the protocol there. Now, just back to the introductions. Gary Ray, I'm the chair, certified hearing commissioner. Done a number of hearings in this district, and I'm forward to this hearing as well. And with me is.
Morena koutou. My name is Ros Day Cleven. I'm an independent commissioner based in Ōtepoti, Dunedin. I've got a background in resource management planning, and I'm also familiar with this district, having sat on panels.
Thank you very much. Also, we've got Tara Lyons here, who's the hearing administrator. We've got Ollie McIntosh, who's the 42A reporting officer, beaming in from somewhere far away, I believe. And thank you for joining in. And we will also have his traffic consultant, Matt Collins, coming in at some stage as well. Before we go to the applicant's team, I'll just go through a couple of things. Panel has read the information that we've read the Section 42A report, the reports attached to that. We've read the applicant's expert statements, and more recently the summary statements have arrived, which we'll have presented to us today. Also seen the legal submissions from the applicant's counsel, and Roz and I have also been to the site. We came through yesterday and had a look at the site, and just saying, a curious thing is I've done a number of hearings here, but I didn't know there was an underpass under the highway until recently, until it was pointed out as part of the evidence on this hearing, I'm ashamed to say. But we had a look at the site yesterday, and feel reasonably familiar to talk about the particulars of the site. So make that point. Now, I'm assuming there's no procedural issues to be raised, but is that the case?
That's the case.
That's the case. Oh, very good. The only thing the panel did issue minute one a week or so ago to ask Mr. McIntosh just to confirm the status of the housing supply and rental supply reports by Benji Patterson, which were attached to his 42A report, and he did respond on that, and that'll be a matter of discussion today at the hearing. Thank you for doing that, Mr. McIntosh, and that would have been circulated to the parties, so we'll come back and revisit that during the course of the hearing. We've got a timetable. There are no submitters in this application, so there's no submitters to hear from. So it's really just a case of us handing over to the applicant team to answer our questions and present their case, and then we go straight to the officers. We fully expect that we'll be finished around lunchtime today, but we'll see how it goes. We're grateful for the evidence that's been provided. It's very clear, and have some questions, but other than that, I think at this stage I'll just hand straight over to Ms. Hill to introduce her team and to present your opening submissions.
Thank you, sir. Morena kōrua, ko Rosie Hill Pukuingoa. This morning I'm counsel for the applicant, RW Cromwell Limited. So if I could just introduce our team. To my far right, I've got Mr. Gates, who's the applicant.
Thanks, yes.
And Mr. Duthie, our planning expert for the applicant. To my left, Mr. Langwell and Mr. McIlrath. Is that correct? How do I pronounce it? Thank you. So Thank you, Commissioners. As you've noted, you've pre-read all of the materials. So today I think is a moment in time to go through the most salient points for your decision making and answer any questions you might have. The summary statements that were filed yesterday for the three witnesses are not new evidence, rather they provide a concise summary of the key issues, and a couple of the witnesses do also have some minor corrections to make as we work through those as well. So I'll take you through those when the time comes. In terms of the synopsis of legal submissions, since those have been pre-read, as I understand it, I won't labour through and read them verbatim, but if it pleases the Commissioners, I might just reiterate a few key points and clarify some things. So on page 1 of my submissions, I open by way of introduction to the site, which it sounds like you've observed yourselves. And as you will know, in the consenting of a proposal like this, the consideration of effects takes into account all mitigations and conditions proposed. So at my paragraph 2 there, I've set out some of the key conditions which mitigate any effects. So those are also traversed in the evidence of Mr. Duffy, but in summary, and some key changes were put forward in evidence after the preparation of the 42A report, so may have changed the report writer's opinion to some degree. So that includes a comprehensive visitor accommodation management plan, a draft of which is attached in Mr. Duffy's evidence, but as you note, will be updated in live time, as you like, when the consent is implemented. The components of a site and parking management plan and the objectives the same are also included in the conditions. One of the changes proposed in the evidence as lodged was to require a single property manager to be used across the whole of the site to provide for comprehensive and consistent management of visitor accommodation. And finally, there are a number of general consent conditions restricting effects on the nature of group bookings, maximum guest numbers, noise and outdoor use, signage, and other matters. So I'll just pause to note there that one of the comments made in the 42A report was to the effect of Mr. Duffy's reference to framing the conditions based upon other CODC consents issued. I just wanted to clarify that while the conditions have been framed based upon consistency with other VA consents issued, it's not necessarily to be taken as Mr. Duffy suggesting that those are a precedent for appropriate grant of VA consents in this case. So in my submission overall, I say that those are collectively a comprehensive and robust framework of conditions which will ensure that the activity operates predictably and with environmental effects no greater than, and on the applicant's evidence, often less than a permitted long-term residential occupation of the site. So it's not contested between planners that the application is overall a discretionary activity. And in summary of the applicant's case, the evidence says that it will represent an efficient and effective outcome for the site, that it's an appropriate land use in the context, and that the proposal is overall consistent with the policy direction of the medium density residential zone, particularly when reading those objectives and policies on a holistic basis. So the first section of my submissions really gives you a little bit of a flavour of the site and context of the application. Now, from paragraph 6 onwards, I run through a bit of a history of the planning context, which involves the original master planning of the site under the COVID-19 recovery fast track legislation. In summary of those paragraphs, I refer to the nature of the master planning of the whole of the Wooing Tree development as including lot 604, so the application site being earmarked for a future visitor accommodation or traveller accommodation activity. Now, I've included a screenshot of the fast track legislation approved master plan at my paragraph 8 or figure 1. However, I do appreciate it's a bit granular when printed, and Mr. Duffy's got some clearer plans to hand up as well when we talk through his evidence summary. So the point of those submissions to set out that planning context is to note that in my submission, the site itself has been earmarked since its inception in this master planning context as being earmarked for future traveller accommodation or visitor accommodation use. And whilst that was never obtained through land use consent in the fast track process or subsequent RMA consenting of the site, it has always been in my submission clearly earmarked for that purpose and master planned accordingly. And I think that in summary, the 42A report author and Mr. Duthie differ in respect of how they weight that history or planning context. In my submission, it is a weighty and relevant matter for your consideration. And in particular, that goes towards sort of three key reasons. The first of which, if I can take you to paragraph 13, the first of which is under paragraph 13A, I think its relevance in terms of the physical planning and orientation of the site. So Mr. Duthie talks about this a lot, his evidence at paragraph 33 and paragraph 87. But as I say there, the super lot has been designed in a way that it's located for the potential use for visitor accommodation to integrate the site effectively into a wider surrounding environment. And what I mean by that is you would have observed physically on the site, it is contained towards the south. It's bordered by the vineyard planting, the state highway area. To the east, it has the more commercial node operations rather than being centred within the residential precinct itself. That's a physical outlay from the master planning context. Second of all, I say that it's relevant in terms of the consideration of effects on housing supply and availability. In my submission, the 42A report fails to consider the consenting of the site for visitor accommodation within a wider estate development, which has contributed overall to significant residential housing supply. So what I mean by that is that I think that it's appropriate to consider the effect of use of VI on the site in that wider context of the master planning of Wingtree. And Mr. Duthie will talk you through the numbers in that regard. So I think it's 373 odd, residential houses ultimately consented and being developed at Wingtree, and this site being a smaller, contribution towards that. Thirdly, I say it's relevant in terms of the assessment of effects on residential character and amenity values. And I note this remains, I think, a matter of concern in the response to minute 1. And in my submission, expectations of surrounding residential amenity values for residents of this relatively newly established estate should be assessed in the context of that master planning of the site. Again, as I say, earmarked for visitor accommodation use. Now, what I mean by that is that in the fast track consenting, as I mentioned, these master plans and the landscape plan clearly denote the site for visitor accommodation use, and purchasers, I think, would have purchased in the knowledge that that exists. Furthermore, the fast track consent as issued obviously included a range of conditions, some of which were consent notice conditions to be registered on title. And they're reading through that, there were consent notices registered on this title and the adjacent commercial super lots, which restricted some forms of future retail activity. And that was, as I understand it, for concerns relating to particular types of retail that might have a competing or undermining effect on the commercial centre. Now, in my submission, had that been a real concern at the time of this lot being used for VA, that could have easily been a consent notice restriction in that regard. So, residential purchases, when considering amenity and character effects, I think are eyes wide open, what I'm saying. Fourthly, I think that this, history and context of the master planning of the site is relevant in terms of precedent effects as well. And I turn to that at the end of my submissions. But overall, I'd suggest that the more recent RMA consenting of the site last year in 2025 for comprehensive medium density residential use has not superseded or completely shelved all of that master planning context. Certainly not physically in terms of how the site has been oriented on the ground, and also not in terms of those other relevant factors. So that's just a bit of a preface, but I guess having said all of that, I do want to reiterate that whilst the applicant's case is that weight should be given to that context, the application doesn't rise or fall on it. It stands on its own 2 feet in terms of the assessment of effects on the environment and the objective and policy context about whether, this site is appropriate for visitor accommodation use and a discretionary framework. So turning to the effects of the proposal, the first heading there I've got paragraph 17 is in respect of traffic and parking supply. The focus of my submissions has been on the projected shortfall of parking spaces for the proposal. And in summary there at 21, I set out that the applicant's case is that a range of parking shortfall for this application is similar to that predicted in the council's peer review reports. So in the order of somewhere between 27 and 30 spaces. And also that this falls into a middle band of a modelled range of parking shortfall calculated for medium density residential use. So Mr. Langwell can talk you through that further and the applicability of that modelling to this local context. But in submission, in summary of my submissions, I would say that overall it's relevant to consider that baseline being the residential use of the site and the consequent parking effects and compare that to the VA development. In that regard, the applicant's expert conclusions are that there are less than minor effects of the proposal. At paragraph 26, I just reiterate that point about the distinction between the Section 42A report authors' consideration of those baseline effects and also that the ABLE peer review in respect of these adverse effects, when I read it, it doesn't appear to support an actual conclusion as to the degree of adverse effects of a parking shortfall. So I think that's a key distinction between the applicant's traffic and transport evidence compared to the council's peer review. In terms of parking layout and manoeuvring, I think I'll leave Mr. Langwell to talk through any concerns you might have remaining in that regard. But turning just to parking management and feasibility. My reading of the 42A report was that there appear to be issues with certainty of the conditions and enforceability to mitigate effects of parking management of the visitor accommodation proposal. We're happy to workshop and talk through conditions at the end of the applicant's case if that would assist, if there are concerns regarding that. But in my submission, the suite of conditions, so the visitor accommodation management plan, the site and traffic management plan, and the ability to have a single property manager will combine in a way that effectively can create that certainty. And in my submission, we'll have, I guess, a higher degree of condition oversight than a residential use potentially would. So paragraph 31 now, I talk about the effect on residential housing supply. Now, some of this may have changed given the observations from minute 1 and the response to the same. But at paragraph 33, I set out why in my submission, Mr. Duthie's evidence appropriately relies on the conclusions of the applicant's economic evidence from Mr. McIlrath as compared to the economic reports prepared by Mr. Patterson and which were appended to the 42A report. So I think you've picked up on some of those key issues which were observed in minute 1. But in my summary, some of the reasons to rely and prefer the evidence of Mr. McIlrath is that the Patterson reports are somewhat out of date compared to the evidence of Mr. McIlrath based upon recent data changes and the planning context. Furthermore, they were prepared for a different purpose and not for this hearing. They're not prepared specifically for this application and not cast as expert evidence as well. They also, because of that reason, they make no direct conclusion in respect of the effects of this proposal, which is what the Commission is tasked with assessing in terms of residential housing supply at either a district or a town level. So the conclusions in the 42A report that a tangible reduction in districts' availability of housing stock is not with respect to expert evidence in this hearing. But as observed in the reply to minute 1, things may have moved on anyway since then. So I do want to observe though, just quickly in paragraph 37, there in the 42A report, there was some analysis made of another consent, so RC 230159, in terms of providing some context around where other Central Otago District Council decisions have declined conversion of a residentially approved development into visitor accommodation use. Now, the commissioners will of course be familiar with the fact that such decisions are not binding anyway, but I've taken the opportunity to, in any event, point out some distinctions between that case and this one. In particular, I think, aside from it being a different sort of residential context to this application site and not having all of that planning history that I've discussed at the start, it was a different planning framework as well. So a non-complying consent and a more restrictive consenting pathway in that regard, and also opposed by a number of submitters in opposition, which of course this case isn't faced with. So to the extent that the Peterson report, and I think it was only the 2024 report, was relied on in that case, I think has limited relevance to this hearing. So it falls, I think, in conclusion, therefore, that the only available expert economics evidence in this hearing for the commissioners is that of Mr. McIlrath, and questions can be asked of him at, when he's called. However, his main conclusions are that there are no material effects on residential housing supply as a result of this application. I think I will turn to, at paragraph 40 and 41, I refer to the relevance of your consideration of effects on residential housing supply in a policy context. My main point to make there at those two paragraphs is that the focus of the zone in the objective 1 is about providing for residential activities as well as other activities which support the purpose of the zone. So in my submission, none of the specific objectives and policies actually are geared towards avoiding adverse effects of visitor accommodation, specifically on residential housing supply. But I will turn to that a little bit further when I look at the objective and policy context at the end of my submissions. So the third effect on the environment that I'll talk through is neighbourhood character, amenity and social cohesion effects. Now, from the reply to minute 1, it appears that there is still an outstanding issue of concern for the 42A report writer. The 42A report considers that the scale of this application has potential to undermine residential amenity and neighbourhood cohesion, particularly where the activity operates at scale across an entire development rather than being limited in extent. In my submission, again, that narrowly looks at the site rather than looking at the site in that wider master planning context, which is the way that the whole of the development has evolved since inception from around 2020. The site has been inherently designed and located as a super lot within that wider mixed use development of residential and commercial activities. In this context, as I keep saying, the site has been designed from an urban design and access perspective for this very use, with prime access to the Cromwell town centre and other commercial options. So to the extent that nearby residents have an expectation of character and amenity values, those have been influenced by the awareness of that master planning context, a lack of conditions of consent, which would preclude future visitor accommodation use, and through an awareness of that staged development of these remaining super lots as well. Residential development is also in a newly evolving character area. And I'd suggest that when you observe the site, in my layman's point of view, it's observably on the outskirt of that rest of the residential context. So, I think it's important when you consider this effect is, in my mind, more, I would say, apparent where you would have a established residential context for a long period of time, and you're later converting it to visitor accommodation use, and it's perhaps more centrally located or perhaps cumulatively located throughout a residential development rather than, a site towards the periphery and adjacent to commercial lots. So in that regard, I refer to what I think is one of the key policies for determination of this consent, which is MRZ P6, which refers to the surrounding area retaining a predominance of residential activities, and for adjoining residential sites, a sense of amenity, security, and companionship being maintained. So, again, I think it's relevant when considering that the predominance of residential activities to consider not just the site itself in isolation, but that wider planning context. Undoubtedly, that will retain a predominantly residential use, and Mr. Duthie provides some percentage figures in his evidence to that regard. I also think, just finally, in terms of assessing residential character and context, it's often useful to hear evidence from those affected directly themselves. And in this case, there are, of course, no submitters and no evidence providing a countering opinion as to actual concerns of residential amenity, character, and cohesion. And as observed by Mr. Duthie, that is despite the fact that the application was publicly notified and directly served on a number of affected parties as well. So again, I make the distinction between that other PODC declined consent, which did have a number of opposing submitters in that case. Now, of course, it's not the be-all and end-all if no submissions are received. There can still be an effect to consider, of course, but I think it is relevant in assessing what the concerns are on the ground. So turning to precedent and cumulative effects, in my submission, there is a little bit of a conflation in respect of the two in the 42A report. In terms of conclusions around plan integrity and precedent issues, I think one of the key starting points is to look at the case law, which looks at the extent to which an application might be repugnant or fundamentally inconsistent with a planning framework. Often those cases are in the context of a non-complying activity, which is of course not the case here. This is a discretionary proposal, and guidance I think can be taken strongly from the policy framework, which doesn't seem to seek to avoid such non-residential uses. Rather, in my submission, the policies collectively look to ensure that such alternative uses are comprehensively and adequately ensured to mitigate any effects on the residential focus of a zone. So in that regard, at paragraph 53, I just summarised there that there are a number of unique factors as well with respect to the site, and that again is relevant to precedent effects. As in the concern for future like-for-like activities. And it seems that one of the concerns in this regard from the 42A report writer seems to boil down to, a concern about the consenting for a comprehensive residential medium density development of a site and a later conversion to visitor accommodation use. And I think that is a little bit simplistic when looking at this site in the context, including for a number of reasons that potentially couldn't be replicated elsewhere. So first of all, as I've mentioned, this site is the last remaining super lot for development in the wider Wooing Tree Estate master planned area. I'm not sure that anyone has identified other similar sites that would have that planning context and master planning history. It's a site, as I've said throughout, that is, physically being located and designed in terms of access connectivity for this particular use and earmarked for the same at a spatial planning, spatial planning is probably a bit over the top, but a master planning level. And furthermore, there are no opposing submissions or evidence on the application. So I think those are all quite unique factors to this proposal. As such, it's unlikely that the granting of the consent would lead to a proliferation of like-for-like applications in the future. And this represents a site-specific outcome. Moreover, as I've said, and Mr. Duthie will talk you through probably in more detail, as a discretionary consent, and when we work through the objectives and policies, I don't think it's fair to say that there's an irreconcilable clash with important provisions when read overall. So now I think I'll just take you to, rather than going through again the objectives and policies in that context, just skip to specific section on the same. In terms of the objective and policy analysis at my paragraph 60, when considering whether a proposal is consistent with relevant objectives and policies of a plan, decision makers are required to undertake a fair appraisal of the objectives and policies when read as a whole. A robust assessment against the objectives and policies of the relevant planning provisions has been provided in Mr. Duthie's evidence, and he can take you through the same in his summary. His assessment is that the medium density residential zone objectives and policies find support from the application, and it accords with the same. And the overall policy direction of the zone, such that a grant of consent would promote many aspects of the plan. I think a key difference between the expert planners in terms of the assessment and objectives and policies is the extent to which the medium density residential zones enablement of residential development and diversity comes with an exclusion or prohibition or avoidance on other activities such as visitor accommodation. Mr. Duthie considers the objectives and policies of the zone on a holistic basis and appropriately points out that an enablement of residential outcomes does not infer an avoidance requirement for visitor accommodation uses. In this regard, he concludes on the effects on residential character and amenity values being effectively mitigated by conditions of consent. And that includes, as I've walked you through, in respect of transport matters, and urban design effects to a lesser degree, as having less than minor effects on the consented baseline. This is the only approved visitor accommodation facility within Wellingtree. It is the potential use for up to 46 units within a wider development of around 373 houses, which would, of course, ensure that the area remains predominantly residential, and that's consistent with Limb 4 of Policy 6. So the plan's policy framework overall requires an assessment of scale, intensity, and compatibility with surrounding residential character. There's no policy direction around a specific scale or intensity of visitor accommodation, and these will be application-specific judgments. Objectives and policies must be read in their context and with plain and ordinary meaning. The support for residential use through the objectives and policies of the MDR zone in my submission do not infer a deterrence of visitor accommodation per se. So in summary of the applicant's case, there are no more than minor adverse effects overall, and it's appropriate for grant of consent under section 104(1). As I've mentioned, the applicant will call evidence from Mr. Langwell, Mr. McIlrath, and Mr. Duthie. And I'm happy to answer questions in respect of the legal submissions either first or in the round with witnesses, whichever the commissioners please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you taking us through that. You've touched on considerations, so we may have some questions for you at this stage. So I'll first of all hand over to my colleague to see if you have questions.
Thank you, Ms. Howard. With regard to the objectives and policies framework, and if I can take you to paragraph 65 of your submission, just wanting to check understanding the point you're making here where you've stated the support for residential use does not infer deterrence of visitor accommodation use in all instances. Is it your submission that if the plan was seeking the deterrence or avoidance of visitor accommodation, that it would be directive and specific about that within the policy framework? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and so for example, you say in the Queenstown Lakes District Plan, there are more, I think, contextual policies around the specific effects of visitor accommodation use in residential areas. Whereas in this MDR framework, we've got, a lead objective, which is about, the MDR zone provides primarily for more intensive residential living, as well as activities that support and are compatible with the zone's residential focus. So I do think it's a more balanced framework than one in which, you might see VA as a non-complying activity and associated objectives and policies with a more stringent direction.
And so at paragraph 64, that's further to your point in terms of the scale intensity and that there's no policy directing a specific scale.
That's right.
So that's again in your submission signal that at a policy level, it's not a matter that was considered to be outlined in detail in terms of what's expected.
That's right. So again, it's a discretionary activity. And for example, PC19 had the opportunity to say, preclude that to a greater degree, either through activity status or more directive policies in respect of the same. But rather it's left it to be a discretionary activity, I think with a number of guiding factors, particularly in policy 6, around assessing the effects of the same on overall residential character and amenity and other values.
Thank you. At paragraph 44, you mentioned the extent to which nearby residents have an expectation of character and amenity values. And within that, you talk about the conditions of consent which signal future visit accommodation. Can I just be clear what conditions you're referring to there? Was that part of the fast track consenting process?
Yes, so there's two aspects to that. So the first is that the fast track consent is approved in condition 1, as you'd normally say, as per, plans of consent. So generally in accordance with stamped plans.
Yes.
And the plans associated with that do earmark the super lots as, for visitor accommodation use. So that's prescribed into the master plan at that level. Now, secondly, I also mentioned the consent notice conditions imposed through fast track as well. So those, as I mentioned, reference constraining some types of commercial and retail activities on those remaining super lots. However, they don't constrain visitor accommodation use. And nor, of course, did the recent granting under the Comprehensive Residential Development MDR rule under the RMA.
Thank you. And my last question relates to appreciate that you were deferring your comments to parking to your expert witness. However, I was interested in the legal aspect of the requirement for accessibility parking. So at paragraph 28, you noted that the plan provides no specific requirement for accessible parking for this activity. And I was interested, irrespective of whether the district plan requires that, is there any other legal framework, for example, the building consent, for example, that would require that accessible parking is provided if parking is to be provided, if the provision of parking is part of a proposal? Or is that subject to a separate process? Or
yes, I think there's two answers to that question. First, I'm not sure if there are other requirements in the Building Act or I think about the legislation that might impose that, but I could research that or discuss that with Mr. Langwell. But the second answer is, as you've observed, that would be, even if those did exist, I think that would be separate to your decision making under Section 104 and in accordance with the district plan. So if there were extraneous consents required or approvals required outside of the RMA, that is that's generally regarded as a sort of parallel track to obtain.
Thank you.
But we could look into that better. Or Ms. Billingham may have other thoughts on that.
Thank you. Right, yeah, thank you. I just had probably two more questions on paragraph 53. Mainly. That's the factors relating to the site, all the unique factors. First of all, I just observe it's probably unusual for an applicant to feel required to do that, to establish unusual circumstances for a discretionary activity application, but you've done that anyway, probably in the event that we look at the objectives and policies assessments and come to a conclusion that visitor accommodation is not actively encouraged. Is that why you've done it that way?
It's actually more of a response to the 42A report concerns that there were precedent effects. So first of all, I've stepped through that case law that actually sets quite a high bar for precedent. And as you've observed, less so in the case of discretionary activities. So that is the starting point, I think, that wouldn't normally be
right, yes.
And then as a backstop, I guess, if there were, concerns about a precedent, it still seems to be a little bit of a flavour coming through in the 4th of May response to minute 1 in terms of concerns about enabling visitor accommodation consistent with the purpose of comprehensive residential development provisions. So I think, it's still relevant to look at those unique circumstances of the site.
I see,
In
yes.
response to that.
Yes, because generally if something's a discretionary activity, you could almost say it's encouraged in the zone, and therefore if it happens somewhere else, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Would that be a fair proposition? Subject to site assessment and all those sorts of things.
But that is a fair proposition, and I was going to put some case law to that effect to you, but sometimes I think that it's easy to draw a bow of general kind of case law about discretionary activities, being provided for subject to mitigating effects appropriately, but it's so contextual, we should look at the application, but there is case law to that effect.
All right, and just one more question on that first one. The site is the last remaining super lot for development in this master planning area. I just wondered how relevant that particular point was, because this activity with this application is to change the use of consented development that hasn't been built yet, but it might well have been built, and then the application would be to change the use of it. Could it not be argued that the same could apply to existing built development? So the fact that it's the last lot available, just wondering how relevant that is. I can understand it is the last lot available, but this, if there was to be a precedent caused or created, could that not apply to an already developed lot within the development?
Well, I think less so, because for the reasons that I've set out, it's because of that master planning context where, the super lot is designed and located in a way that you couldn't replicate that elsewhere in the development. I think you would have different residential character and cohesion effects if it were more, centrally located, or it were kind of elsewhere within the site. So I think it is relevant that it is it's not necessarily, I take your point that it's not, the point is not necessarily about it being the last remaining lot. The point is more about that, planning context of this site. And I don't think that concern about conversion of comprehensively developed medium density super lots into VA after the fact could necessarily be triggered by grant of this application because of that unique context.
So thank you. And just a final question. You've mentioned PC19. I think Mr. Doothy's done that too. And I think the point being made is that if the council was concerned about the advent of too much visitor accommodation or in the wrong locations, it would have strengthened or at least addressed it in the provisions of PC19. I'm not familiar with, we have looked at PC19 in the context of other things, but what is the overall purpose of PC19? Is it to do with housing supply? Is it to look at amenity considerations? Is it a complete review of the residential chapter? Is it fair? I guess where I'm coming from, is it fair to say that because PC19 didn't address visitor accommodation, then
I
would it have done so?
Yeah. Well, I did actually have a look at submissions and the 42 reports yesterday on PC19 to have a think about that. And there were a number of submissions in respect of visitor accommodation and how that could be appropriately provided for or constrained within the zone. So it was a matter that was fairly within the scope of submissions and evidence and was raised. And the report writer did turn their minds to alternatives such as, providing specific overlay areas for constraining VA use or providing a tiered regime. I think one submitter, Mr. Sean Dent, I don't know if you know him, expert planner in Queenstown, suggested taking the framework from Queenstown for VA use, which is more that tiered framework around 60 days permitted, 90 days discretionary, over that non-complying, for example. And so these were matters that were directly considered, but the 42A report ultimately landed on a discretionary framework and particular controls, specifically in policy 6 around ensuring effects on things like residential character and amenity values were effectively mitigated. Mr. Duffy might have some context on that, but that was my reading of PC19. And in terms of its purpose, I'm actually not sure, but I thought it was a intensification and change response.
Whole residential?
With the whole, yeah. So it was a whole review of
So
residential
it's a fairly
zones.
complete review of the
comprehensive.
residential chapter. Okay.
Yes, sir, but it didn't introduce the medium density residential zoning
Yes.
with a view to certain areas to provide for a higher intensity activity.
Thank you for that. No, that's clear. The submission is very clear. We understand it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, commissioners. I'm sure other questions might come up at the end, but perhaps if we start with the witnesses.
Yes.
So I'll first call Mr. Langwell, who has a summary to read out and a couple of corrections to make as we work through as well.
Thank you, Mr. Langle. Welcome to the hearing and thanks for your evidence and summary.
Good morning. Thank you. I think will probably start with my correction. It's in my main evidence in chief on page 7 and paragraph 27. This is a paragraph where I discuss the Transport for New South Wales guide for transport impact assessments. And there's 2 categories I mentioned there, category 2 and 3, and you may have picked up on it, but the description of both categories is the same. It's an error on my part. It's category 3, which is the one that I'd like to correct. Now I can dictate that out to you now. We can also provide it later along. It's a very similar description to category 2, but this is the statement that it makes. It says typical of regional areas or outer urban areas with low or limited alternative transport options, low population density and high car mode share. So effectively it is just a category shift to, a less accessible community compared to category 2. And that, I think that's reflected in the numbers that I discuss in terms of parking. So those are the difference between the 2 categories, but we can provide you with that description.
Yes, I think you have it. Just do that as part of a reply. If you
Yes.
do yes, we've made a note of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll probably return to my summary statement now, and I'll just read this out. It's very brief.
Sure, read it out, yes.
Paragraph 1 I won't read. That's just some context about what my summary statement is. And I'll start at paragraph 2. It provides a summary of the existing transport environment and transport aspects of the application in paragraphs 10 and 11. I will not repeat these here. My evidence also addresses the key elements of the transport assessment provided for in the application, namely a shortfall in manoeuvring depth of the parking spaces and a shortfall in the number of parking spaces provided against the relevant transport standards and their impact on the adjacent network. With regards to the shortfall in manoeuvring depth, I am satisfied that both parking areas will operate safely and efficiently with a reduced manoeuvring area and will not have an influence beyond the site. All manoeuvring areas will occur within the site and will allow a 90 percentile vehicle to be able to enter and exit the site in a forward direction. Sight lines are suitable within the parking area and at the access point, and vehicle speeds will be low, reducing any risk of crashes occurring. I note that Council's transport peer review also considers a shortfall to be acceptable. With regards to the shortfall of car parking spaces, I consider the identified parking shortfall of 73 parking spaces for visitor accommodation as theoretical based on a literal application of the rule framework and will not be experienced in actual demand. There are a number of factors that contribute to actual demand and parking for visitor accommodation. For this particular proposal, I expect that not all dwellings will be utilised for visitor accommodation at the same time, and it's also likely that all dwellings will be occupied. Sorry, it's unlikely that all dwellings will be occupied. This reduces the overall demand on parking activity within the site. We also support draft conditions of consent that limit the number of people utilising visitor accommodation within the site, and the implementation of a visitor accommodation management plan, which will also contribute to managing the related parking demand. My evidence also considers a baseline of effects and the expected parking demand of the consented residential activity. I estimated that there is the potential for a spillover of car parking demand beyond the site of between 24 and 46 cars if all the dwellings were occupied at the same time. This would be consistent with the maximum spillover parking demand of around 30 cars I have estimated for a fully occupied visitor accommodation activity for the 160 people. Taking these factors into consideration, I am of the view that the related demand for the visitor accommodation activity will have a lesser effect than what may have experienced with the consented residential activity. I'm therefore confident that with the provision of 50 on-site parking spaces and the implementation of a visitor accommodation management plan, and any adverse effects relating to car parking demand can be appropriately managed. I have read the Section 42A report as it relates to transport effects and the transport peer review prepared by Mr. Matt Collins of Abley on behalf of the Central Otago District Council. Mr. Collins generally supports the application, subject to some recommendations to manage potential traffic effects, namely some adjustments to the draft visitor accommodation management plan, and including of a communal accessible parking within both parking areas. I have reviewed the updated draft visitor accommodation management plan included in Mr. Dovey's evidence and acknowledge that each of Mr. Collins' recommendations have been adopted in that plan. I am neutral on whether accessible parking is provided. However, I do not believe it would be appropriate to allocate these spaces for communal use. If there are visitors with accessible needs, they are unlikely to be travelling alone, and they can be easily loaded or unloaded within each parking area immediately adjacent to the pedestrian connections to the car park. This would provide the same level of service as providing dedicated accessible parking spaces and minimise any overspill of parking from the site. And then just final with conditions, I have reviewed the applicant's proposed conditions and consider these to be appropriate to apply for the proposal from a transport perspective. Do you take questions now, Mr. Chair?
I've just got one question I could ask you first. A lot of what's proposed relies on the visitor accommodation event, call it the event. As I understand that, there's a lot of detail in there, but basically it's a reasonably theoretical thing. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, can you help us understand, does it work elsewhere? You devise these management approaches elsewhere in similar situations, and do they work in practice, bearing in mind that there's to be no on-site management component or no on-site supervision by a person? Do things play out in practice without issues in your experience?
Well, I think the use of management plan generally is becoming more common. I have been involved in a couple of examples in Queenstown where visitor accommodation, in this particular case, it was hotels and motels with limited parking supply, where conditions of consent were applied for managing parking demand, managing the expectation when people are booking for parking demand. Yeah, and then obviously continuing to manage that on site to make sure that the effects are contained within the site. Unfortunately, both of those two hotels that I mentioned are yet to be constructed. One's underway, but they're certainly a mechanism that's being considered and established in other proposals. I'm also, I quite in the view this is a live document, this management plan, that has the ability to be able to continue to modify it. There's also a condition and a review clause in the draft conditions which allows the council the ability to be able to monitor complaints and understand and
Yes,
and then takes things. So I think even though there might not be examples that have been a success, I think everything within the framework of the VAMP and the review conditions gives the ability for things to be monitored and adjusted, changed as time goes on.
So if for instance there is overflow parking issue with the surrounding streets, even though it's not expected to happen, it does happen for whatever reason. The number of complaints are lodged, it's recorded, there's systems in place for that.
Correct.
And conditions can be reviewed under the section 128 clause, but as I understand it, the 128 doesn't allow the consent to be reviewed. Once the consent's issued, it's issued. So it comes down to conditions themselves. And if there's only so many parking spaces available on the site, it turns out there's clearly a demand for more parking. I'm just wondering where that would leave the council and what options would the council have in those situations if there can't physically be more parking provided? Could there be changes to the VAMP that would look at the demand side of it, or thinking of the worst case scenario?
Yeah, so I guess there's two mechanisms there. There's one condition of consent that specifies the number of people that can be on site related to it.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And within the VAMP, there is also then the ability to update the VAMP and it might limit the number of dwellings that could be used for visit accommodation as well. I mean, that might be a way in which you'd.
That was where I need some help from your council on. As I said earlier, I'm not sure that a review condition can constrain a consent in that way, but I might be wrong. But that would appear to be limiting the scope of the consent itself rather than the conditions. But it's very theoretical what I'm putting to you. I guess we're looking for some confidence that there are options available. Yeah.
I think the other thing, I'm not to assist the witness as well. I'm happy to look at that section 128 point and the constraints around when it might override a consent or not. But yes, the VAMP and the TMP are, appropriate and necessary to mitigate effects, but we must also look at the degree of effect that's being mitigated. And in this context, it's on the one hand, you've got a consented residential development for 2 or 3 bedroom units. So they could be between 4 and 6 people living, 6 cars, and there's no constraint on the use of the same. And, as Ms. Lingwell refers to, the modelling of the demand in that scenario is somewhere I'm not very good with numbers. I think it's somewhere between 27 and 46, 24 and 46 or something, right? So, you've got that sort of shortfall already there, not constrained by conditions versus, a VA component, which does have the ability to signal expectations, direct, types of bookings towards single use cars. And the shortfall is more or less the same, or is within a range.
I mean, baseline comparison is favourable. I think we have got evidence.
They've got the gist of it.
Yeah, I just think that I was mainly interested in your experience as a traffic. You've obviously supported this, and to some degree the council's consultant is too, Matt Collins. So I might ask him a similar question. But we're relying on your experience and expertise and the work.
Yeah, certainly too, Mr. Chair, from a council's perspective, they also have the ability to control how parking occurs on the street by establishing certain parking controls, undertaking enforcement and those sort of things. So those things are outside of the consent, but those are measures that can be undertaken or identified if there is a particular concern with how people are parking. I mean, if I look at Wooing Tree Avenue, for example, right now, there is a bus stop marked in a parking bay, which from all I can establish was identified or focused on being related to what the visitor accommodation might have been while it's there, and also to help the Wooing Tree commercial activity if they had coach activity. There's an opportunity there to remove the bus stop if it's never going to be used and create more parking. Interestingly, and throughout the entire estate, even though there are 2 things that are happening there now, there's a lot of indented parking bays that identify where you can park. Outside of that, and you would have noticed when on your site visit, there's a lot of new landscaping just gone in, which stops people from parking in the wrong places. So the next alternative to happen, if for whatever reason all of the parking bays are full, is people will start parking within the carriageways because there are no stopping markings or anything like that. So council has the ability to control the parking within the carriageway if they like. Most of those carriageways, and especially Wirinchu Avenue, are wide enough that you could allow parking on one side and ban parking on the other side, and you'll still have the ability for all types of vehicles to pass and emergency vehicles to pass. It'll be a single lane, but so there's I guess there's more and more measures that the council could undertake or require the applicant to undertake.
They would be last resort measures.
Correct. Yeah, that's if you are experiencing an actual over demand or a demand higher than supply, which at the moment would be to be determined because not all the residential activities constructed or occupied.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your answers to that question, and it's quite a long question. Sorry,
that was a long answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's all the questions I have on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Landwell, I do have a question with regard to accessibility needs, and your paragraph 19 in your summary talks through how it is unlikely to visitors with accessibility needs are unlikely to be travelling alone, and they can be easily loaded or unloaded within each parking area immediately adjacent to the pedestrian connections to the car park. So could you just explain, is that a scenario that is set out and proposed on the master plan we have in front of us here? Or is that a scenario that you're...
It's an operational scenario.
Right.
So it could be that the car stops briefly within the aisle and people are unloaded right next to where the pedestrian access goes through to the buildings. And then that vehicle then proceeds to go and park in its allocated space. And that was the scenario that I was trying to explain.
Thank you. And so is that a scenario that if we were to find that it would be appropriate to have such a scenario, is that something that can be provided for in the van or in the conditions of consent? Can it be provided with some certainty as part of this process?
Yeah, I imagine so. It's completely up to the panel too, is that you might decide that there is a condition that says accessible parking is provided. My view on it being is that it's not of a high demand, and if you wanted to set a control out like that, then that would be described in the van. I mean, that's an easy thing to manage it. So I think it's something that any activity would manage if you had for example, if you provided accessible parking, but there was a greater demand for accessible parking, that sort of scenario would come about. People find their way around it. I think it's maybe self-controlling.
Is it worth mentioning, when we've considered these accessible parks, it's unlikely someone in a wheelchair will be staying in one of these units because we've got ground floor bedrooms, but there's no ground floor bathrooms. So they've still got to get up a set of stairs to go to the bathroom. So, I don't know how relevant it would actually be.
Well, I think there may be an assumption there that everyone with mobility issues is in a wheelchair and would require a fully contained unit. There's quite a wide range in my understanding of mobility and accessibility difficulties.
No, I was thinking more if you need the accessible car parks, whether they need the extra space to get in and out, because it's a wheelchair.
Yes.
That was the only
right. So mobility issues, in my understanding, it's often having proximity to, so there's less time to walk because you might find walking difficult, for example, or perhaps I don't think there's my understanding
but again, those sort of people aren't going to go into a unit with a whole lot of stairs to get to the bathroom, are they, if they've got walking issues?
Well, I think those sort of people can probably decide that for themselves. Yes. Yeah, I'm just curious because I think it's quite a reasonable expectation that they're for anyone in the community to be able to access a facility. So I'm interested in that point.
Understand.
Well, thank you. That's good. Incidentally, Mr. McIntosh, is Mr. Colin is he online? Has he been listening to our questions? Oh, you are, Mr. Colin. You're welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning. Did you have any questions of clarification on our question from this witness at this point? I understand the discussion. You have questions?
No questions from me. Thank you.
That's right. I should always give the officers an opportunity to ask any questions of clarification. Same with you, Mr. McIntosh, too. No questions? Okay. All right. We'll move on. We'll move on to the next witness. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. The next witness will be Mr. McIlroy, the applicant's economic witness. He also has a summary statement.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll read my statement. I understand you've got copies. I'll just skip ahead to paragraph 3. In the summary statement, I offer a starting point in terms of the wider context of housing situation in Cromwell, present my views about whether the proposal will impact on residential housing supply and if it will have a materially adverse effect on the rental market in Cromwell, and summarise the economic assessment undertaken in response to the RFI. When assessing the economic effects of a proposal, the context within which the change will occur is important. In my view, the context consists of the current conditions, trends, and outlook. Cromwell is a key urban location in central Otago, and the town has experienced sustained population and economic growth. The growth is seen in 2 dimensions: demand for housing and ongoing development of new housing supply. A growing economy as seen via strong increases in visitor economy activities. These 2 dimensions form the context. Population and economic growth have seen an increase in demand for long-term rental accommodation, with the market responding accordingly. Concurrently, the planning and development context has evolved with plan changes. So that's plan change 19 and 21. And that's resulted in the rezoning of greenfield land for residential development in Cromwell, Alexandra and Clyde, introducing the medium density residential zone and increasing development capacity within and adjacent to existing urban areas. As a result, the available development capacity and supply pipeline for residential development has expanded in the past 2 years. Developments such as Wooingtree have contributed to this by introducing a broader range of housing typologies within the Cromwell market. Ultimately, 2 questions are important. Is there sufficient capacity to accommodate growth and demand for housing? And would the proposal lead to a deficit situation if the units are used for visitor accommodation? As shown in my response to RFI, this December copy, ongoing residential development, including within the MDRZ, continues to add to the overall housing stock and provides a range of dwelling typologies capable of accommodating both owner-occupiers and renters. There is no deficit and a surplus position is projected. The second question is straightforward to answer. In simple terms, the 46 visitor units is subtracted from the capacity projections. Using Rationale's visitor yield analysis shows that even if the proposal proceeds, there is significantly more capacity or supply than demand. While specific dwelling capacity is not reported, interpreting the figures, so that's the graphs, not figures as in numbers, suggests that over the long term, there is in the order of a 3,000 surplus capacity. In this context, 46 units at lot 604 represents a relatively small component of the overall residential capacity enabled under the current planning framework. Enabling the use of these units for visitor accommodation will not lead to a deficit situation. Rental accommodation is a part of housing supply, and I have considered the potential effects of the proposal on the availability of rental housing in Cromwell. The rental market and trends are covered in various reports prepared by Mr. Patterson for Council. I provide an updated analysis of the rental market in my evidence. I do not report that analysis, but I note that Mr. McIntosh acknowledges that the updated evidence is the most relevant evidence regarding the economic and housing supply effects. With reference to the potential impacts of the proposal on the rental market, in my view, the key observations are: rental bond data shows that since 2018, rental housing provision in Cromwell has increased both in absolute terms and relative to the population. On a per capita basis, rental provision has increased with a very strong growth in the past 3 to 4 years. The data suggests that the rental market is responsive to increased demand. The 46 units subject to this proposal account for approximately 5% of the overall rental stock. In my view, the proposal is too small to materially alter the overall rental housing market and availability at a town level. It would not adversely affect the functioning of the rental market or overall housing supply, and any potential impacts will reduce even further over time as additional housing from PC19 and 21 is delivered. The proposal will support the local visitor economy and diversify visitor accommodation offerings. Commercial accommodation stock is weighted towards holiday parks and lower cost accommodation types, with more limited provision of the higher value purpose-built accommodation. The proposal helps to fill this gap, thereby helping to attract and retain visitor spending. By supporting visitor activity, tourism expenditure is captured. In turn, this contributes to local business activity, generating GDP and employment impacts. The site is near the Cromwell town centre. It's around 200 metres away, meaning that it is likely to capture spending and keep it locally, increasing the likelihood that visitor expenditure is retained within Cromwell and supporting businesses. I used the scenario approach to illustrate the scale of additional spending that could be attracted. A scenario approach is appropriate when dealing with a range of variables. In this assessment, the variables include occupancy rates, visitor behaviour, and broader market conditions. I estimate the annual contribution to be between 2.4 million and 4.3 million. The proposed development as a new, high-quality, well-located accommodation offering is likely to see additional spending towards the upper end, the upper estimate. Supporting the local visitor economy will help grow the economy, lifting the economic well-being of the community. I consider that the application has the potential to generate positive economic effects. And in conclusion, I have considered the economic effects of the proposal, including its implications for the housing and rental market segments, the potential economic benefits associated with enabling visitor accommodation. My analysis provides a sound context and assessment of the proposal's likely economic effects. In my view, the proposal will not undermine the Council's identified sufficiency position in terms of housing capacity, so that's supply sufficiency. It is unlikely to result in a materially adverse outcome in functioning of the already responsive local rental market. The proposal has the potential to generate positive economic effects, including increased visitor expenditure, support for local businesses, and associated employment in tourism-related sectors. The additional annual spending is estimated at between 2.4 million and 4.3 million dollars, and is likely to be at the upper end of the range. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for that. Any questions?
Just one question, really, just for clarification. In terms of the definition or the distinction between short-term accommodation and long-term accommodation, and how they can both represent visitor accommodation, does it have any particular bearing on the assessment that you've undertaken?
So short-term I would normally classify as sort of, less than a week, longer terms a few months, but it doesn't really have a substantial impact on this.
Thank you. That was all my questions.
All right. Yeah, no, thank you. I haven't got a lot of questions because we read your evidence in quite a lot of detail that led to us issuing minute one to hearing the council reports. So we've had a good look at that and we understand it, but maybe just two questions. I just wanted to ask, just so I'm clear, to what extent have you relied on theoretical supply? And you mentioned PC19, PC21, which I think was the Parkburn one, which we sat on. These commissioners sat on and made decisions in relation to the 500 additional houses at Parkburn. To what extent have you relied on theoretical supply versus actual zone supply?
So for that assessment, well, for this, I actually went back to council's own information and had a look at the reports that they had prepared. So I didn't go down let's call it a business housing capacity assessment and did my own numbers. But I know that council actually had quite a few reports going back several years, and I looked at them and they all kind of end up in the same sort of ballpark in terms of numbers. There's obviously some movements up and down, but I'm thinking reasonably comfortable in terms of the scale of the numbers that they've come out with. I've had a look at the rationale's methodology just to make sure that it kind of makes sense, and I am comfortable with that. Yeah.
Okay, and I just had one sort of particular question, I guess, paragraph 49, the economic benefits of the application. And make a point that the application has potential to generate positive economic effects for Cromwell wider district by supporting visitor activity, increasing local expenditure, and so on. I just wondered, how does that how would that compare to permanent residential dwellings? So that is it more? I assume it's more, but I just wanted you to tell me that
It's different.
it's different.
It's different. But visitors tend to spend more. So if you think about your own spending patterns, if you go on holiday, your per day spend is more, right? So that's, I guess, the short version, short answer to your question. So it is greater. Yeah.
Okay, so it could be double or 50% more, or
it depends on the type of visitor that you attract. But in this instance, I'd say it's likely to be approaching double.
Thank you. That's useful to know. Other than that, your evidence is very clear. I've got no further questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. McIntosh, have you got any questions or clarification at this stage of this witness?
No, thank you.
Yep. All right. Okay. Thank you very much. Right. How are we going for time? 15 minutes of tea break. We might just carry on.
We have Mr. Duffy, our last witness.
Yeah, we might spill over after the tea break, but we might as well start. So
Happy to fit in, Mr. Chairman.
thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Look, I've got two corrections to make to my evidence in chief. I might do those first, if that's all right. The first is at paragraph 116. There I was outlining for you the size of the commercial sites. I put those in at 1.5 hectares. I should have put in 1.2 hectares. Just for your information, half a hectare for this site, subject site. Pretty much half a hectare for the Celador and the future commercial block, and then 0.2 for the preschool. In one sense, I've called that commercial because that was what was in the original proposition, because it is run as a commercial thing with a catchment much wider than Willow Tree or Cromwell. By the other hand, it's a community facility because it's a preschool facility for in the community. The second correction is at paragraph 120 in B, where I talk about what's happening in Moving Tree with the housing. You will have seen that, and I used the reference those terrace products. What I'm really trying to reference was the high density between the 180 square metre sites and the 260 square metre sites. The market conditions, it's probably the terrace product is not moving so quickly. There's a lot of duplex going in, and you will see that if you were in there yesterday afternoon, you will have seen those 2-story home and income duplexes, and there are others underway that are in the planning stage, and then zero lot line development, and so pretty high intensity residential. So with those two corrections.
If they could be tidied up in the report, that would be useful. Just thank you very much.
I'm reading from para 2. This is a proposal to enable the option of visitor accommodation for the consented 46 dwellings on the site, and that's in addition to the permanent rental accommodation options. There are no physical works. There is some minor external signage on parking and noise control, but effectively no external works. So the building design, the bulk and location, the landscaping, the parking and waste management have all been worked through the existing consent. And when we get to the policies, I'll refer to how they actually reinforce under policy 6 and in the policies in section 6 of the plan. This proposal is supported by a suggested set of conditions, including a requirement for the VAMP to ensure the integrated management and mitigation of any visitor effects. And with your permission, Mr. Chairman, at the end of my evidence, I'd like to talk to that briefly. The effects of development in terms of residential character, built form, design of units, landscape and waste management, all assessed and approved and are unchanged through this proposal. They're all appropriately mitigated. And the issues boil down to traffic and parking, impact on rental accommodation, although that may no longer be actually correct given the minute you issued and the response from Mr. McIntosh. And the neighbourhood character, amenity and social cohesion. In terms of the transport, the original rating anticipated a 90-unit visitor accommodation. And so the wider transport network was designed with that in mind. So the road widening, the outline of the roundabout, the length of the entrance road, Blondie Drive, into the Wollongtree subdivision and all turnout areas in that location was all designed with a 90-unit visitor accommodation on this particular site. Mr. Langwell identifies how the effects of parking can be successfully managed if there's a transport management plan. That's an element required in the conditions of consent, with relevant elements including the VAMP, and I've listed what they are and I'll talk you through those when we get to that point. I rely on Mr. Langwell in terms of the other traffic matters. On the economic considerations and rental accommodation, I won't read all that. Simply to say that I think Wollongtree will contribute to the residential development of Cromwell. Like it's 25.4 hectares, 1.2 of which is going to go into commercial. The rest will be in residential, but parkland and there's road, and that sort of deal. You take out 15% for roads. It's 373 residential dwellings, of which all but one are sold and under development, plus the 46 that we're talking about on the subject site. And you will see from there that I think that my understanding in checking my other client, who's Wollongtree Development Limited, was that there are all but 100 sites. Sorry, there's about 100 sites yet to start. Everything else is either built and occupied or under construction. And in terms of this site, there are 9 sites across the road and 1 next door, residential sites, 6 across the road and 1 next door, all occupied. Whether they're rented or unoccupied, I obviously don't know, but they're all occupied. And 3 are GJ are in the final process of completion. And you will have seen that the homes were broad typology across the sector, with the lower density in the north coming through to the lower density in the south. Social cohesion. The 42A report suggests that the provision of visitor accommodation could have more than minor adverse effects on the neighbourhood character, residential amenity, social cohesion. And I address these in my evidence, but I'd just like to make 3 quick points. Wollongtree took a formal rural site immediately north of the town centre and developed for a residential neighbourhood of 373 homes. And with your permission, I'd like to just hand up the plan, which may be helpful. So, and if you could, so I'll give it.
Thank you.
Sorry. Apologies, it's too.
Sorry.
It's 2 different. I've given you the summary plan, which is this one here, but just to help, clip behind that's the actual subdivision plan, which has got all the sites and all the levels and all the information. I'm not suggesting it's relevant to these proceedings. I didn't want to give you incomplete information, so I've given you the pack. I think the core point in looking through this is obviously that's our site there, marked for travellers accommodation, which it's been marked that way since day one. This proposition was to create and focus the development that was not core residential down on the southern perimeter, so that it was the town centre, then the state highway, then the vineyard buffer, then those semi-commercial built around the underpass and built around the entrance into Wollongtree. Then there were the green linkages that pull up to the park in the middle of the site, and the periphery around the outside with the lower density in the north and east, so that the existing residential neighbours in Cromwell North had sections of similar corresponding size, not the higher and density activity. Point about social cohesion. If social cohesion is not about what's happening on lot 604, social cohesion must be about what's happening in Wooingtree. And this is a master plan development. And look, at the time it was called community development or neighbourhood planning. But it's the same concept of social cohesion. And it's about building a framework where the community can interrelate and work with each other. And so that's why the open space network is in the middle of the development to bring people into those locations. The retail component is on the underpass connection through into the town centre and the southern periphery to give a bit of a buffer to the state highway, and which the vineyard development does as well. So if you look at social cohesion and how do we build a community and make it happen, in my view, the master plan development, as assessed by 2 panels through the fast track process and by the council actually with modifications, is set up to actually deliver that social cohesion. And it doesn't rely on lot 604. But having said that, I think 604 will also contribute to social cohesion because it will have the look and feel of a residential development in that location. It will meet all those landscape controls. There is the risk of the parking overflow, and Mr. Lang will address that. And I've got a suggestion when we come to the conditions of consent to pick up the Commissioner's question about how do you manage if it all goes wrong and how do you manage mobility. And yes, 10 direct neighbours, when they look across, might be looking at people who are owner occupiers, might be looking at people who are renters, or might be a batch overnight stayer. But that won't undermine and detract from what I believe is a master plan coherent community, which can develop itself in terms of a coherent issue.
We might take questions on that social cohesion aspect now and then have a break.
Yep,
if that suits you.
Yes.
And I did the wrong question at this stage, but thank you for taking us through that plan. If I was to put the proposition to you that the 46 or 56 units
yes,
were to be scattered throughout that development, would that have a different impact on social cohesion than you? Rather than being on this site, if they were spread randomly throughout the entire development, would that have a different effect?
If they were spread throughout the development, in theory, no. In practice, it'd be really hard to do that because the density has been pretty much maxed out in this location.
In practice, it would be hard.
Yes, the only area you could do that would be on that northern periphery, and that was all about keeping faith with the residents of Cromwell North and not putting the high density on their boundary. So,
I see.
yeah. So I personally think that this is the right location for the 46 units. And I also personally think that the option to give people the opportunity to have this for a booker batch style, we call it visitor accommodation. It's not a motel or a hotel. It is a series of individual units where the person has the option, if they want to make it available for visitor accommodation.
Understood. Yeah, I can understand the concept. The master plan, yeah. So the master planning process, initially, as you said, it's always had visitor accommodation in this location. Yes. But am I right in saying it was withdrawn at some stage through the consent process, and then?
Right. Well, sorry. Yes, technically yes. Technically yes. I was the planner giving advice to Wooingtree Property Development, and I was part of the team that put together the original contract with Paddy Baxter and Baxter and Felix. The always that was identified as travelers accommodation, and look, this was under COVID when the concept was Central Otago is struggling because the tourism industry is in trouble, and we need to take people employed in that industry and get them into the construction industry. That was one of the key drivers, notwithstanding that it was get a residential focus. It still recognised that in this particular site, it was appropriate to future-proof this for travellers accommodation. So it's always been through. When Redwood asked me to prepare the application for this area, when in the pre-consultation stage, we did have visitor accommodation included. The council raised issues with us and concerns And for various reasons, we backed out the visitor accommodation and proceeded with the residential component of it. And then Mr. Gapes tasked people, the consultant team sitting at this team, to go back and work through the council issues to find whether matters could be mitigated or couldn't. And if they could be mitigated, what would that look like in terms of the consent? And so we worked up what is the current consent before you and placed that before the council.
All right.
So yes, there was a technical point where it was withdrawn, but it wasn't a case of saying this is the wrong thing to do. We said to the council, we will go away, we'll understand what you're saying, we will carefully consider that. And we came back actually before it's built, so it's
No, that's useful. I
changed.
thought I'd read that, so thank you for fleshing that out for me. Any questions?
Really, when you mentioned before that this is not a motel or not a accommodation facility in the traditional sense, but it's standalone units that may or may not be used for short-term accommodation or longer term. In this scenario, I'm aware in the region that there are perhaps employers who are buying accommodation to house workers or large-scale construction or project developments, and there's quite a high-profile fast-track application in at the moment, which may bring, depending on the outcome of that.
Yep.
Is that something you have contemplated in terms of the intended use of this, and does that have any bearing on your assessments or your kind of planning opinion, I guess, in terms of how this might be used?
Sorry for the previous answer, yes and no. I don't think that, I looked at this from a planning perspective and say, is this a good place for visitor accommodation? I'll come to that in my summary statement shortly, but for the reasons that it's obviously, in my view, a very good location for visitor accommodation. Having done that, what's the negative? Is that to the benefit of the landowner and the residents, and does it meet the Section 5, social economic well-being? Yeah. And I gave that a big tick. And the next question is that a compromise to the residents of Tree and that portion of Cromwell in terms of their social and environmental, so economic effects? And I've answered that by saying it could be if you don't manage this correctly, and if you manage it correctly, you can mitigate those effects and do it. And hence we've drawn up, when we get to it, a robust set of conditions based on Mr. McIntosh's list, and he very helpfully published and said, look, if you are going to approve this, here's my suggested list of conditions. We've accepted all of his conditions and we've added a bunch others, and I'll explain why when we get to that time. And we put the vamp in. So I think you will find that not everybody's going to want to do book a batch. Because some people will want to keep it for themselves because they want to come here for holidays and second home because they're here on a work thing and they just want a rental accommodation or they want that area. And I think there'll be some like that. But there'll be others that will go, gosh, we'd love to fill the place in Cromwell, but we need a bit of income support to do that. And they'll want to put it through the Airbnb or book a batch. I've called it book a batch in here, not trying to use the brand, but the concept of that. Yeah.
Before we break, I think there are more questions. Mr. Gates, you're here. We haven't got a statement from you, but can I ask you a question while you're here, just to take advantage of you?
Yep, sure.
You're the developer of the applicant, isn't it right? Yeah. So we understand the scope of the application, and did that come about through a sort of an assessment of market demand, or a lot of people have approached you that you perceive a high demand for visitor accommodation? You want to get a consent that avoids people having to go individually to council and seek a resource consent. You want to, what are the, is it all of the above, or what's the motivation?
Yeah, look, it's probably a bit of all of the above.
Yeah.
We're doing quite a lot of development in Queenstown.
Yes.
And what we've identified is that a lot of our tradesmen and people working on our sites actually live in Cromwell. and they're either renting here or they're bought here. And so we saw it, we saw it as a market that we should be getting into because, the Queenstown market's incredibly expensive and a lot of the ladies and the people that we employ can't afford to live there. So I think that the people that we've sold to, around 30 of the units have sold already. So, and we'll get a mix in there of people that got a few owner occupiers that are people moving in, couples, and there's a couple with a young child moving in. Probably half of the other people, the rest of the people are investors. Half of them will probably do it long term because they can't be bothered with the Airbnb because it's a bit of a pain in the bum to manage and all the rest of it. And then probably half of the other people will probably Airbnb at a period of the time and they'll come and stay in it. They'll use it over school holidays. They'll Airbnb it the rest of the year. So, I think you'll get a real mix.
You're sort of after flexible, you're after a consent that will allow flexibility for future owners.
100%. And it does add, a purchaser perceives that it adds value, whether or not they're going to use it for Airbnb. So it just gives them that flexibility.
Useful. No, we sort of surmised that would be the situation, but it's good to hear from. So
I think a lot of our purchasers, buy it on the basis that they probably Airbnb it part of the time, didn't realise how, difficult it is, and the return is probably just as good to put it into a long-term rental, and they'll probably end up doing that. But I don't know though, but that's what sort of what we find.
Okay, well, that's useful discussion. Look, we'll pause your evidence right now, and we'll come back to it. And useful to get that introduction. We'll have a break for tea, 15 minutes or so. Sure, everyone for service. Okay. All right, we'll take a adjournment for 15 minutes. We convene with Mr. Duthie. So thank you. Just carry on from where you left off. Yeah.
Comment point 15 on the statutory considerations. Look, I set out my views on that in my primary evidence. This is a discretionary activity, not a non-complying activity. I represented tree development in Plan Change 19, and we explicitly brought a submission in support of visitor accommodation and discretionary activity and spoke about this particular site because it was the only site to my then client of interest to them and the support for it. And we talked about the benefit of the site visitor accommodation. It reinforced the town centre because you were right through the underpass and in the shopping centre for the first time, North Cromwell, within a safe walkable distance of the town centre, which up till then was a vineyard. And then, close to 8B, a good transition between the housing and the town centre, ideal site. And the council, and therefore I say it's no coincidence that visitor accommodation is there. It was brought up before the council. They had the opportunity to consciously decide, actually, this is not what we want, and we want to do something else. Rather than that, it was confirmed as a discretionary activity.
What we might do too is ask you questions as we go.
Yes,
that's
by all
okay.
means.
Yeah, because it helps us. But thank you for that. So that embellishes the answer that Ms. Hill gave, doesn't it? When I asked about whether PC19 was squarely to do with visitor accommodation, and you raised it in evidence at the hearing. What did you seek any refinement of the objectives and policies, or were you satisfied that they capture visitor accommodation? Was it an issue at the hearing?
Others had raised it as an issue, but from my professional perspective, I thought the objectives and policies were fine because it said we want to take this zone and we want to bring a higher intensity of development around our town centres, in this case Cromwell. And that's what Wooing Tree was doing for 373 sites. And then it said, but we also want support uses. And we had a preschool, we had a shop, and it was a dairy thing. And they didn't want to get out of scale to protect the town centre, which was a big issue. And therefore we dialed back the intensity of those uses. And then they said, we want visitor accommodation, discretionary activity. And in applying section 32, they realised, or they formed the conclusion, that this was the best method to give effect to the objective and policy of providing for supporting uses which drove economic development, in this case, including into the Cromwell Town Centre. So the council themselves formed the view, well, the officers who prepared the section 32 report and the commissioners that heard that formed the view that as a discretionary activity, it was an appropriate method to give effect to the objectives and policies as then set out. Now, yeah, so the answer is I personally was happy and my client was happy because they got the decision they wanted and there were no appeals or no further action.
That's useful background, so thank you.
And look, as I've said, I won't belabor the point, but as I said, if the council had concerns, they had multiple options to deal with it, and that was the time to deal with it. You don't go, oops, we made a mistake, we've changed our mind, we don't want to do that. If that's the case, the council should put another plan change and change the policies. They shouldn't use a resource consent to do it, which is a discretionary activity if we manage the effects properly. And in my view, and relying the land law in terms of the traffic and parking, this development does successfully manage those effects. I won't go into that. I'll probably just jump now into that point 20 and the policy 6, which was the main one that relies on, in my view. And this is the one that deals with non-residential activities in this zone. And the first point it says is that they don't want any adverse effects on the activity, including noise. Now, in my view, the conditions of consent and the VAMP give you a Rolls-Royce noise control mechanism here, way beyond what's happening in normal housing. There were two issues with noise. One was, how do you make sure you don't get reverse sensitivity off the state highway because it's too noisy on these houses? And there's a special 80-metre control along there for particular glazing and particular issues.
And it's bund as well.
Yeah, and the bund. And so Redwood in their development will need to comply with that tick. Then the second thing is, how do you make sure the residents who are short stay don't hack off everybody around them? And the VAMP does that. And then in the question of how do you police the VAMP? Well, you've got 46 landowners in a body corporate who appoint a property manager who are going to make, in my view, jolly sure that if they get a recalcitrant visitor accommodation at night, they'll comply to it. That's the internal residents, let alone the fact that the surrounding residents around that area will have the name and number of the property manager, and they'll ring them up. And if all else fails, they'll ring the council's helpline on noise control. But my view, VAMP and the conditions are set up to be self-policing in that the residents who are living there won't want it, and they, in case of the body corporate residents, they appoint the property manager and they can fire them and replace them if they're not doing a good job. And the residents around it all have those contacts. So I tick noise. We already know that streetscape and visual amenity and landscaping and that is unchanged. Mr. McIntosh says that he agrees that the effects are successfully managed through the existing consent. Only issue that then raises is, well, what happens about spillover parking? And I think Mr.
Excuse me. On the issue of noise and the off-site manager, how will that work in practice? So is it something you've seen elsewhere? Because
Yes.
I mean, there are benefits. There are clear benefits to have an on-site manager, as a generic observation. But have you seen it work elsewhere where the manager is off-site?
Yes, I've seen it work elsewhere on other activities where the manager is off-site. Look, if you appoint a poor manager, you'll get a poor result. But the motivation for the body corporate is to get a good manager, A, because they're living in amongst it, and B, this property manager is helping look after their own property, so it's in their commercial interest to make sure it will. And B, they've always got the prospect that the council, if they get difficulty with this, they can take enforcement action against failure to manage and properly operate this consent. And of course, one of the commissioners mentioned previously, you've got the 128 fallback as well on the conditions. So I think that there's every motivation on the body corporate to appoint a good manager who understands what they're doing. It's not like it's a complicated task, and I think it can work successfully.
It would be,
Which may or may not be an absentee landlord. The manager might be someone who lives on the site permanently, by the way. It's not saying needs to be off-site, but it could well be an off-site manager.
if it is an offsite, well, would that person be resident, would be someone from Cromwell? We can, I'm just,
They're going to have to be.
they're going to have to be.
They're not going to be able to manage 46 units. So it might be a Bailey's property management, but they'll have a local, because they'll be there all the time. These things are, they're notoriously difficult to manage. The cleaner doesn't turn up, and then, they need someone within a phone call away to be able to, deal with issues.
I'm just thinking of the situation where there's, say, the Warbirds event is on or something, and people are having parties on their balcony, if there are balconies, and there's a bit of noise, and it's 11 o'clock at night, and there might be a person's number you ring, but that person come to the site and close that down, or is it just with the controls? Is that how it works?
In the developments we're doing in Queenstown, we actually are required to put a sign in the unit with the property manager's phone number on it. The requirements around, I think you can't use any of the outdoor areas after 10 p.m.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's all listed there. And if you have any issues, ring the property manager.
Yeah, I understand all that. It's just a question of, what happens to ameliorate the problem right now? It's keeping me awake. How's it going to be resolved right now? Will someone come around and deal with it? And I understand that if there's a build-up of complaints, the council can have a look at it and maybe look at conditions, but how does it resolve the daily occurrence of something?
If there's a property manager in Cromwell, they'll deal with it. But of course, the council has, with its noise enforcement powers, if it's a rented accommodation for 3 months while builders are working in Queenstown and commuting there, and they have that ragey party at night, that control is with the council, as they do every night of the week already. So it's not like no one's had a right taken away from them or a right compromised. They've had an additional opportunity to enforce this matter through the property manager.
Yeah, I understand. And I know we must compare it to the current situation in a residential neighbourhood. And we do understand that, but we're just testing the sort of parameters, I guess.
And absolutely fair enough.
That's what we're doing.
So we're looking at in particular there, I think conditions 17 and 18, which prescribe the requirement for a designated on-call manager to be available 24 hours per day to respond to complaints or operational issues. So it's quite clear, I think, that the requirement is that they are available, so probably proximate, to respond on the spot in 24 hours a day.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so that's been addressed in conditions. We'll come to those conditions towards the end. But thank you. I'll just raise that issue right now, but thank you very much. Please carry on.
The second arm of policy 6, it talks about the nature, scale, intensity and character of the development is that of a residential development, which it clearly is. It's been consented as that, it's been designed as that, it's been built as that, and it does not undermine the viability of the business resource area. Now, not only does it not undermine it, in fact, it helps reinforce it because, as you said, Mr. Chairman, I think that way is right next door and it drops you right into the town centre. For the first time, a safe crossing of State Highway 8B all hours of night for people, and it's well lit. The third aspect is, again, about that undermining the viability. Sorry, I conflated the two. I'll cover that. The fourth one is retains predominance of residential activities in adjoining sites, a sense of amenity, security and companionship. So amenity, I think, is all set out there. If you go into Wivingtree Estate, you'll see it's the landscape, streetscape amenity is a very high standard. I would suggest to you that it would be at least equal, if not better, to any of the other newer developments in Cromwell. The amenity on the site through the conditions of consent of the existing consent will ensure slot 604 respects and contributes to that amenity. The security is there with the property manager and the issues we've raised, and all these sites went through a SIPTED process, so they've all got good overview of the street and the laneways within the complex. And again, the only issue in the companionship is, I already spoke to that previously about and I think that's there. And then you've got this issue of, okay, what happens if there's spillover parking? There's too much parking in the street. And Mr. Langwell is saying, well, it's not likely, but if there is an element of tolerance because there's issues there. But if in your worst case scenario, Mr. Chairman, you posed a question earlier on, the council does have powers through doing this, and you can impose tighter conditions to respond to an effect that there's a protracted history of overflow parking, which is causing demonstrable problems in that. You've got that power.
And thank you. And just on that, one option was mentioned would be to reduce the number of units that can be VA, but I don't know if we've got the ability to do that anyway, or the council would have, because that constrains the consent. But another option that was put forward was to reduce the number of the occupancy of each unit, so that instead of 4, it would be 2. For instance, there's 1 car instead of 2. So that'd be within the scope of a 128%. Do you think?
So respond to the legal.
Probably a legal point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But probably, but remember that this is more likely to be the parent, caregiver / parents, whatever the sorting is, traveling with the young people, and people want their own bedroom. It's not necessarily going to be, 2 adults in that room coming from Dunedin, 2 adults in that room and coming from Tekapo. It's, a lot of this, in my view, and from what's been done elsewhere in the Redwood developments and seen elsewhere, it will be people who are families, and they like the fact they've got a full kitchen, a full laundry. They don't have to use the motel or hotel food and beverage type things. They've got full facilities here, the kids' clothes. That's where I think you'll find that this will be well used, and it will be 1 car, 1 family, but they're utilising 2 and sometimes 3 bedrooms.
Yeah, and again, I just reiterate, when I'm looking at a worst case scenario, I understand the evidence and the expectations. It's really just options available if there is an issue, and whether 128 reviews can work and have a realistic outcome. That's what I'm looking at here.
Yeah, I can provide some more context on that probably in the reply, but I've had a look at case law, and the test seems to be about whether the consent would continue to be viable after a condition change. And it seems like that's actually a reasonably high threshold. So some examples include a Golden Bay Marine Farm case where it looked at, reducing the extent of the consented area in the CMA. So, used to have a proliferation of marine farm and actually tightening it and reducing the structures provided. So, that's kind of a similar example when you think about, 46 units and similarly reducing the scale and whether that would or would not be viable. Obviously, there might be some
Viable from an economic perspective.
Well, that's correct from an economic perspective, which is kind of unusual because in this case you don't have evidence as to that at the moment. So there may be questions of fact and degree on that case, but we can certainly provide some more information around the worst case scenario, what tools there might be. There might be other solutions as well, not just constraining the number of units to be letted, but for example, the terms upon which they could be to, as you say, number of rooms, or constraining only to 1 car park use, or there's probably a range of.
Yeah, we probably don't need to explore each and every one. It's really just for the panel to have some comfort that section 128 reviews can be practically used, or whether it's not going to happen because the site's hasn't got the space for parking and so forth, if that is the case. So I think you've covered it pretty well, and maybe just in the reply, address it again. That would be useful. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Duffy. Sorry to.
And then the 5th one, Chairman talks about vehicle manoeuvring on site. I think there's not concern about that. And then 6th one is safety and efficiency of the roading network. And I think that's where the original Wooing Tree has solved that problem. Big land take for roundabout and road widening and the full design. I spent a lot of time with NZTA, both in the original consent and this consent, the one before you today, going through it. They're happy. signalled to you by the fact they didn't object, but I did speak to them extensively about this issue. And the seventh one is not applicable. It's a retrofit type issue. At 21, I said, in my view, this is an ideal site to visit accommodation and residential zone. It's right on the roundabout of State Highway 8B. Vehicles can access the site with minimal impact on residential streets. It's not like this is embedded in the middle, which could be a social cohesion question. It's right on the periphery, right on the transition between the residential and the commercial. I say it has no social cohesion issues. The underpass makes it incredibly safe to cross the town centre. I've belaboured that point, I won't repeat it. And and look, in my view, if you meet the provisions of section 12 of the objectives and policies of the residential, and that policy 6, then in terms of the section 6 objectives around the needs of people and communities, amenity values and quality of life, I think those are already covered off in that area. So I say to you that this proposal does meet the objectives and policies of the plan as a whole and taken in context. Now, the particular policy that says provide for residential development, this is discretionary activity for a particular activity. The relevant policy, in my view, therefore, is the one dealing with non-residential activities in a residential zone. It meets part 5, part 2 of the Act in section 5 in terms of that balance that's got to be achieved. And I think it does that successfully. The economic development is well covered in the evidence that you've seen today. And I don't think that's, I think that's agreed that there are economic benefits, and I think it's now agreed that there's not a compromise on the rental. The environmental is covered off successfully, and the social, it's a benefit to the landowners and the residents because they get the option. The only question is, does this compromise the other residents? And the suggestion is in social cohesion it might, and I've outlined why I don't believe that's the case. Let me just finish up by talking to you about the conditions of consent. As I said earlier on, helpfully, Mr. McIntosh included a set of draft conditions of consent, which have drawn on happened elsewhere in the district and the surrounding councils. All of those have been accepted by the applicant and are included in the version that handed up in my evidence. I've added a couple of extra conditions. I've explained in my evidence. A couple of those are belt and braces and may be redundant, but I've the new condition 3, which just says that you've got to build the structures before you occupy for visitor accommodation. That's just to make sure the landscaping's in place and those waste management plans are there and everything is fully up and operational. I've made it clear in condition 5B that the contact details of the property manager a person in the organisation. And look, if you're concerned about the proximity, you could add a provision in there that would cover that off. In 13, we've made it explicit there's no playing of the amplified music in the private open space between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m. just to stop that overnight issue. Again, it's probably belt and braces because it was part of the application, but we've made it clear it's no commercial advertising. And like there's no motel sign or no vacancy sign, which would impact the amenity of those neighbours. The application is framed on the basis we wouldn't do it, and this condition here imposes on the consent holder that as a condition. We've put others on the signage around it and photographing and lodging those signage with the council so that those are all covered off. We've cross-referenced in the waste management control, which is in the underlying consent to make sure that happens. Then we've got the registration of units process, so the council is fully aware which of these units are operating under this matter, and they're able to track and manage that through the process. The visitor action management plan is drawn from examples that have been used elsewhere, particularly in the Queensland Home District area. But in my view, and working with Mr. Langwell, we've tried to set this up so that we've covered off both the traffic and the social sides of that. In there, it covers what the property manager, well, it makes the appointment of the manager. There are X's in this because obviously you can see if you grant this consent, and then if you do this in the appointment process. But there's always manager contact details in what this person is required to do before any unit goes into the pool, which is to make conditions of visit. Then when it gets into pool, it's set up so that there's full information given to the respective client, visitor, before they turn up, so they don't turn up with no surprises, and that identifies limitations and restrictions. Then there's the house rules show, and then there's a whole lot of stuff about noise management. And then there's the complaints process and how those are worked through. Just conscious of a question from the commissioners about mobility access. We've got 50 car parks on the site and 46 units. There's a 1-to-1 allocation. There are 4 car parks in the pool, or in a discretionary pool, if you can use that term. If we allocated those to sit alongside the walkway that runs through the middle of the site, and you can see it on the, I'm sorry, it's in black and white, but on the diagram there. If we took those 4 sites and put those in the pool as the discretionary ones, then the manager can do that. And if we do have people turn up that need easier access, they can simply be allocated that. Yes. And a tradie that came in that might otherwise have gone there can go into the space that they've vacated because they're sitting in one of these pool sites. I think we could put a condition in which would solve that, and we'll put that in the VAMP, and Ms. Hill will probably, the practical way is probably to, if you agree that's a sensible idea, we'll suggest some wording in the written reply. Thank you for your time.
Right, thank you. Just see if we have any follow-up questions.
Yes, I do. I've got a few questions of detail,
Yes.
just in terms of the drafting. Is it a good time to run through those, or?
Yeah, I don't think I have any other questions. It's one that I've not managed to see in any of the reports, and Mr. McIntosh has probably dealt with it, but what I'm going to ask is, how does the current rule framework deal with visitor accommodation as a permitted activity? Is it a permitted activity subject to 30 nights stay, or is it not permitted at all? It's always a
There's a homestay, and look,
oh, that's the homestay.
Mr. McIntosh, so I both agree that that's irrelevant to your consideration.
Okay.
It means that someone living in the house and they've got somebody with them. It's a much smaller scale.
So this is different to a lot of plans. I was involved in a variation in Christchurch City for this very visitor accommodation topic, and I think what we concluded was 30 days a year was 30 nights a year was permitted activity, and 30 to 6 months was a discretionary. You know, there were categories, but in this plan, there's no, other than a guest stay. Did you say homestay? Other than homestay, where someone stays with you, it's not provided for permitted activities, right?
Yeah, correct.
All right, no, that's useful to know because. Yeah, thank you very much. Now I'll let you give the details and conditions.
Condition 4. I wondered if that condition might would require the timeframes for certification. In terms of how that condition might work.
So for example, the council must certify within 20 working days or something like that.
Yeah. Normally you would see some kind of to give council and consent holder certainty on that process, I guess. Is that something you would?
Yes. Yeah, we can. We'll add. We'll put up a modified conditions and VAMP in the reply, and we'll pick these points up.
Thank you. So I spotted there was the terms operator or owner were used variously in the conditions, so it might just need a check in your final reply for
Okay.
consistency. Yeah. Did say these were really detailed questions, comments.
It takes a fresh pair of eyes.
Yeah. Question 19. I noticed that the onus to record the complaints were on the operator of each unit. And I was interested in why that was the case as opposed to the body corporate, the property manager. How is that deliberate?
So the property manager has to keep it.
Yes.
The body corporate, so I had them kept by both.
Yes.
The property manager always, and I put it to the owner. So the owner is building up a track record, which can sound alarm bells. So it's not just the property manager going, oops, I should have controlled that, I didn't,
Yes.
hiding it. It could be the body corporate or yes, it could be the body corporate.
Yeah, I was just, it was a curiosity more than anything in terms of how the conditions would, the mechanics of them would work together
Okay.
and where the responsibility falls.
So my thinking in drafting it was that if both the property manager and the owner got it, then it would just get that nice tension. But I hadn't thought of it going to the body corporate as opposed to the owner, but yeah. Maybe we could give some thought to that and cover that off in the reply.
And my only other question was, it's kind of, we've possibly covered this already through Commissioner Ray's questions about the role of the property manager, but condition in each accommodation unit shall be rented to no more than one group at a time. I wondered how that would be interpreted or how that could be enforced. Like if people are on couch, I mean, there's a condition somewhere about couches, is no sleeping on couches, but at a practical level, how would that be enforced?
So what that's trying to do is stop someone going, I've got 2 rooms and therefore person X can sleep in that and person Y and they'll just share a kitchen.
Yeah.
What we're trying to do is go, no, you want one, it's a one-on-one relationship and you don't want to have multiple people in the same place.
Yes.
Look, I suppose if someone snuck in and did it, you don't know, but the property manager won't accept one.
Yes.
And I think it's policed through the property manager.
Yes. It was one of those aspects where I thought if there was an on-site manager, they would see that. They would see, it would be more likely to be able to potentially see if people were sneaking a few more people in stretchers or something.
Equally though, if the listing is, publicly available.
Yes.
And I would have thought it was reasonably easy to confirm it's only one listing available for that unit. Because if it was, that you were trying to rent a couch or a separate room, there would have to be 2 listings within Book a Batch or Airbnb, right?
Yeah.
And so that would be quite easy to see and enforce if there were concerns.
Yes, I see.
I think.
And
And the property manager is charged with that sort of oversight. So,
and you've got neighbours and you've got the other members of the body corporate on site. And like if it happened once, you'll probably get away with it. But if someone says, I can abuse the system by doing this, I think it would soon be identified and then it can be sorted out.
Thank you. And thank you for your suggested options for mobility and something we'd be keen to see in how that condition might look drafted in a reply.
We'll draft that up in the reply.
Appreciate it.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I've got no further. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's good. So you have no more questions of your team at this stage?
okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, there might be a short reply at the end, depending on that.
Okay, we'll now go to the officers. Are you okay to go now, Mr. McIntosh, or your colleague? And who would you like to go first? Colin?
Absolutely. Perhaps I'm happy to go with whatever preference you might have, but it probably makes sense to me to have Mr. Collins go first.
Yes, let's do that. Let's do that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Collin. Thanks for being on the line and listening to the questioning of of Mr. Langwell in particular. We've read your statement and we understand there is a level of alignment between you and Mr. Langwell. Did you want to just, rather than read your statement, just talk to us about any of the aspects that have come up or any areas that remain of concern to you? We're just in your hands now.
Yeah, good morning, Commissioners. Yeah, look, happy to talk through the issues. So I think broadly on a technical basis, Mr. Langwell and I are aligned. The key issues that are still in contention at the start of the hearing this morning were around the mobility parking and parking spillover. Now, based on what I've just heard, I think the applicant is open to providing 2 accessible parking spaces on the site. So I won't comment on that any further unless you have specific questions.
You basically support that. Was it 2 spaces or 3? I thought I heard 3, but I might be wrong.
There are actually 4 spaces that would be
Four.
capable of
Yeah. Okay.
getting people in and out of vehicles with particularly wider activity.
Okay, so it might be 4 spaces, but in general, you would support that? Is that something you'd ask for? Certainly. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, that has been something I'd recommended.
Thank you. And the other issue you mentioned was spillover. We had a discussion about spillover parking potential. And any more comments on that?
Yeah, look, it sort of comes down to 3 sub-issues in my view. There's one, whether reliance on street parking is appropriate. 2, how much spillover parking could realistically occur. And 3, whether the proposed conditions and the VAMP are sufficient to manage that spillover parking. So in terms of the reliance on on-street parking, I think this is probably more a planning issue rather than a transport planning issue, but there is some overlap into my area of expertise with transport planning. In my view, public on-street parking is a public resource, and I do have some concerns about it being relied upon to offset a significant shortfall in parking on the site, because essentially that can result in a public asset being privatised for a particular group, and in this case it would be the visitor accommodation. And increased demand from street parking can then create complaints and enforcement issues for council. However, as I said, I think it probably more sits within the realm of planning rather than transport experts, but I'm happy to comment on that further if you wish. But the next sort of sub-issue I had.
Sorry, just on that. Thanks for raising that. The way, I asked some questions on that. The way I understood the answer was that I framed it as a worst case scenario, and I think the applicant answered that question in the event it happens, but their evidence is squarely that it's not likely to happen. So that I think it's not being put forward as a mitigation method. It's a last resort. And I think I took the answer that they wouldn't see that as an appropriate way of resolving it, but it's an option available in the worst case scenario. But I do take your point that it's at the expense of public parking if that was to occur. So it still remains a concern of yours if that was to be relied upon. That's what I took from your answer just now.
Yeah, so, that's correct.
Yeah.
And
okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll sort of talk to that aspect of it in my third sort of sub point.
Okay, thank you. Yep.
So the second sub-issue I had was around how much spillover parking could occur. And I think Mr. Langwell and I are, within cooee of each other of that. Acknowledging your comments there about on-street parking not being relied on in what we would say an unconstrained environment. Mr. Langwell had sort of said maybe around 30 vehicles as a theoretical unconstrained demand might spill over onto the street. That sort of aligned with my assessment as well, which I'd come up with around about 27 vehicles. So again, I think Mr. Langwell and I are aligned on the extent that could occur if it was unconstrained. So to your to my third point, and as you raised about, are the conditions of consent and the VAMP sufficient to manage the risk of spillover parking? And in my view, no, they're not at this point. I think I'll certainly give the applicant their credit. What they've come forward with the adopting Mr. McIntosh's some of the conditions he had suggested, also preparing the VAMP has certainly given me some more confidence. However, I think that there's a few aspects missing there. So my reading of the VAMP and the conditions is that they are largely reactive rather than there's a degree of proactivity, but what's missing is if there is a problem, what happens? There's a couple of gaps in the VAMP. So one, it doesn't clearly identify that guests should be limited to one vehicle per unit. And the parking management plan and VAMP, there's not a clear pathway around monitoring. It seems to be a little bit more reliant on complaints and reactivity rather than proactivity. So in my view, if we wanted more certainty around the control of spillover parking, I would like the VAMP or the site management parking management plan there to be some more solid monitoring, and if there's then that type provisions in there. So what I would suggest is that there would be a requirement to undertake monitoring once the activity has been established, and that might be a monitoring, a monitoring condition is used quite regularly where the transport effects are. There's some question over the extent. So in this case, I'd suggest sort of 2 monitoring time slots. So it might be the first peak tourism season and then the second peak tourism season. And that monitoring would, look at whether spillover parking is occurring, the extent that spillover is occurring, how much that might be competing with other demand for on-street parking, and put in place maybe some indications of when intervention would be expected and what those intervention methods might be. Those intervention measures might be, a requirement for the applicant to make changes to the VAMP, and that might be around, if there's evidence of, bookings having 2, 3, 4 vehicles show up per booking, there might be need for more rigid enforcement of the VAMP. It might need to, Mr. Langwell commented about, parking management within the street, whether that's time parking or things like that. That obviously implementing those comes at a cost for council, and that might be more appropriate for that cost to sit with the applicant. But yeah, look, there are a range of mitigations that could be implemented if this is identified as an issue, but I just think that there's a bit of a gap there at the moment in the conditions and the VAMP versus what we're assuming is going to happen.
I understand that. Thank you. And just to explore one thing with you, in terms of monitoring of spillover parking, just from a lay perspective, I guess, how easy is that to do when the parking might be from other houses on the street, not from the site? Is it easy to identify where those cars originate from? How do you get around that problem?
Yeah, definitely. So it would be, I would suggest that it would require video surveys, which is a fairly regular, fairly typical process that we use as transport engineers. And you might need a couple of cameras set up to basically see how many people are parking on the street and then walking into the site. You could also require people to register their number plate when they're making a booking. It would be difficult. The difficulty would be distinguishing between visitor accommodation versus resident that might be parking on the street. So there could be some complexities there, but if the panel was in mind of this as a way forward, I think between Mr. Langwell and I, we could discuss how we could put in a bit of a framework so that it, one, gives council some confidence of what that monitoring might be, and two, gives the applicant confidence of the scope of their assessment, so that we're not creating an issue down the road where there's disagreement over the scope of what that monitoring might be. I'd recommend that, it is fairly tightly specified to minimise that potential for disagreement.
No, look, that's useful suggestion, and we'll be interested in the applicant's response to that. And the panel, we might, take an adjournment after the conclusion of the council's evidence to discuss that. But I guess as a first indicator, it'll be useful to know what the applicant thinks of that suggestion. It's ultimately for us to determine. But I mean, what I would normally do is invite you to send some notes through as soon as you can on to articulate that, because we've been scribbling notes down. But just, I think I understand that the desire is to have a more proactive way of monitoring potential overflow parking in a way that can be built into a consent condition for 6 monthly reviews, or annually doing the surveys. So we understand the concept. It's probably just the details. So
I think if we could have maybe 5 minutes after this subject, and we have a discussion and then come back to you on it. I think conceptually we can understand the thought process behind a more prescribed monitoring framework, and we'll take on board that comment. But one of the things that comes to mind for me immediately is just coming back to that residential baseline and the extent to which we could, monitor the spillover parking effect from those of the 46 units that have elected to do residential visitor accommodation, maybe not all the time, maybe some of the time throughout the year, and those units which are residentially occupied. So you might have a circumstance over the 46 where a portion of the 2 or 3 beds, as I said earlier, are rented by 6 couples who have 6 cars, and they might have a spillover parking effect in the range that Mr. Langwell has identified, somewhere between 4 and 46. And then, the extent to which we can monitor those car parks and the spillover effects from a portion of the 46 versus the rented short-term spillover effects. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand how that could be appropriately done. Another option, and we can workshop this after, I need to talk to my client about it, but, another concept that I've frequently seen in recent fast-track consents about these monitoring conditions could be more complaint-based. And I appreciate Mr. Collins's concern about that being reactive. However, it is a good, potential demonstration of, the actual effects occurring, and a review condition that provides a report requirement on the first anniversary based upon complaints and other data received. But we'll have a bit of a workshop and come back to you.
Hinged on that complaint thing, aren't they? But it may be not specific.
Not a specific review condition, right? So the requirement, for example, on the first anniversary to provide a report to the council for monitoring, which summarises the complaints received.
Yes, okay. Well, what would, okay, thank you, Mr. Cole. What we'll do then is we'll park that for the moment and carry on with Mr. McIntosh. But after that, we'll take an adjournment, and or you verbally, a written reply would be nice, but you're welcome to respond verbally to that suggestion. And then we'll consider that. We'll conclude the hearing. So, have a bit more time to think about it. All right. Thank you, Mr. Collin. That's excellent. And we'll now go to Mr. McIntosh. Thank you for coming on, Mr. McIntosh. Again, rather than go through your report blow by blow, it's an opportunity just to respond, I guess, to the key planning discussions and questioning we've had with Mr. Duffy in particular, and just to respond to those key planning issues. So we're in your hands as to how you wish to address that, or would you rather just ask you specific questions? We can do it either way.
look, I've been madly scribbling, and I had a few prepared notes coming in. So perhaps if I work through what I have, and I'm hopefully that sort of front foot some of your own questions, and then I'm happy as I move through those to just, you know, take questions that expand on any of those points.
We'll do that. Yeah, thank you.
So I think it would perhaps be helpful to, as a starting point, address a few matters that I still have some of my own questions or you know, lack a bit of clarity around at this stage. And some of them we've already touched on a little bit, but since drafting my 42A report, there's you know, obviously been new evidence come to light, and I'd like to acknowledge that. In particular, the economic evidence is a step up from what I had available to me when I drafted my 42A report. And some of the measures the applicants put forward, I think, are positive steps, but I have some concerns around the mechanics of this consent and how it would work in practice. I understand from the applicant's evidence that they're proposing a single visitor accommodation manager would be appointed by the body corporate to oversee all of the units that choose to take up this consent. At this point, however, I don't think that that's clear enough in the conditions that have been put forward. There's no condition, the way I read them, that explicitly says this has to be a single manager. And indeed, conditions like, I'm looking at condition 19 in front of me, which refers to each operator of the visitor accommodation units, which I don't think it's intended that way, but certainly could be, you know, each operator of the visitor accommodation units, to me seems to suggest that there are multiple. Well, it's not clear that is the operator then the manager or how that's working. So I think there needs some tidy up there. It needs to be explicit that we're talking a single manager and for that language to carry on through the conditions. I don't think it's a big deal because I think that is the applicant's intent. I just don't think it's clear enough at this point.
We did ask that question, I think, question 19, was it? Yeah, we have addressed that with the applicant, but take your point. Yeah, thank you very much.
Going back to the raw mechanics of it, I also question how this would work in terms of who the consent holder actually is. The way the applicant has put it forward, as I understand it, is really that it would be the body corporate fundamentally that holds this consent. However, typically the way these sorts of land use consents operate, they run with the land. In this case, they'd run with the units, and you would potentially have up to 46 unit owners who would be effectively the consent holders. So again, if that's not the intent, then I think that needs to be made very clear, and I'd suggest perhaps section 134 of the Act is relevant here. And it's a point that I guess I think is worth labouring because it has some ramifications for how the monitoring of this consent would work. From council's perspective, who the consent holder is obviously important because that's ultimately who council can hold accountable from a monitoring and enforcement perspective. I also think it's relevant to note here that the applicant has explicitly sought to defer payments of development contributions to future individual unit owners prior to them taking up their consent. And so again, these sorts of aspects to me raise some concerns about how in practice this consent operates. Is it those individual units taking up their consent, or is it the body corporate giving effect to parts of its consent? And yeah, to me, that's not clear at this stage.
Because that's currently framed as an advice note, isn't it, Mr. McIntosh? It's an advice note general to advise of what the contribution would be, and it's not even, I don't think it's even a condition of consent. So it's normal practice, isn't it, to have those as advice notes because they're dealt with separately to the consent. But you're raising that as a potential issue for council and coming after those contributions down the track. It's a concern.
I'm raising it as a potential concern in terms of coming after those, but also just to illustrate the point that at this point in time, the water is already quite muddy, as I see it, as to who council is even, who the relationship is with in terms of, this consent being given effect to and monitored by council. For example, if there are issues and council is needing to take some monitoring and enforcement action, who council is billing for that monitoring work? Is it the individual landowners or is it the body corporate? Like I said, the default would be the individual unit owners. If that's the case, then the concerns that I raised in my report, stand around the significant practicalities and practicality implications for council and the way these sorts of consents work. If it's the body corporate, that simplifies things somewhat, but I don't, as it stands at the moment, the way the conditions are written and all the rest of it, I don't think that's explicit enough.
That's probably a fair point to raise because the consent holders, I see it would be RW Cromwell Limited, but the conditions apply to individual buyers or operators, depending on what the term is. So yeah, we welcome the applicant's response to that. So thanks for raising that.
That's fine. Move on to perhaps parking next and just speak very briefly about that. One of the key issues I've had from the outset, and it has been raised today, is unlike a hotel or motel, there is no on-site management to oversee the implementation of the VAMP and the TMP, which I think is an important point that shouldn't be overlooked. In terms of the traffic evidence itself, I accept both experts' evidence. I don't in any way dispute that any of the traffic modelling is wrong or anything like that. My focus is on the fact that even in the applicant's evidence, there still remains a material shortfall in parking provision. The planning issue here is whether this level of reliance on on-street parking is appropriate within this zone. And I know that the applicant's core argument now seems to be that the approved residential occupation itself would generate similar amounts of spillover. I don't consider this to be an appropriate comparison. It is true that the district plan provides for residential activity as a permitted activity in this zone, particularly in the context of the medium density zone. It's true that under the plan's prescribed rates, it's likely there'll be some amount of spillover. However, it's relevant to keep in mind that the primary purpose of the medium density zone is to provide for housing. the on-street parking within these areas should be available to support surrounding residential uses. And I remain of the opinion that it's not appropriate in this context for a discretionary commercial development to rely on surrounding on-street parking for a fairly significant proportion of their anticipated parking demand.
And Mr. McIntosh, in case you're about to move on to another topic, did you have any further comment to Mr. Collins' suggestions about monitoring and conditions to strengthen the proactive approach to spillover parking? Or do you just suppose that in principle, having spillover parking? Just need to be clear.
I oppose in principle the spillover parking. I think if the panel are of a mind to grant consent, then absolutely I endorse any of those additional measures that aim to address that. And I think, yeah, I think in principle, the idea of that sort of proactive monitoring, I support. I guess I share the panel and everyone else's concerns about how that might work in practice, but I have faith that Mr. Langwell and Mr. Collins can come up with some way of doing that.
Understood. Thanks for that.
Just before I move on completely from that, I think we've somewhat resolved the accessibility issue from what I'm hearing. I guess it's just a point that notwithstanding there's no specific district plan requirements, in my view, Mr. Collins's recommendation that accessible parking for this kind of development is appropriate. I completely back that up, and would just like to reiterate that it would be, I think, incorrect to focus on that being simply for wheelchairs. Accessible parking is aimed at addressing a much broader set of people than those who need wheelchairs, and indeed for whatever their mobility needs are. In 2026, I think any suggestion that, you know, unloading them from a circulation area where people potentially are going to be waiting for that unloading to happen, you know, is not a very dignified or appropriate situation. So I won't labour on about it. I think we've moved on. It looks like we're, you know, the applicant is looking at providing for some accessible parking, which is great. I support that. I guess my question then is around, again, the mechanics of this in a development where, as I understand it, the parking spaces in those two car parks are allocated to individual units, then what, if any, of those spaces aren't already allocated? If they're already allocated, what sort of process that needs to go through? And and I suppose how those spaces are managed, if they're just accessible spaces that are always available communally, I guess as guest parking, or what. That again, there's the difficulty here, unlike a motel or a hotel situation where you've got a manager that can say, okay, well, now we have these guests with this particular need, so we can swap that out for the, you know, they can use unit 1's parking space and unit 1 can use unit 6's parking space. I don't think that's going to work in this situation, because those parking spaces are legally allocated to individual units. I guess what I'm getting at, Commissioners, is I certainly endorse, if we're heading towards approval, I certainly endorse the provision of those spaces. I still have some questions about how that might work in practice. I'm sure the applicant can hopefully address that in closing. Moving next on to the housing supply and economics, as I've already mentioned, you know, we have far better information available to us now than I did at the time of drafting my report. Most significantly, this new evidence is informed by much more recent census and rental data. And I have to admit, I read Mr. McElrath's findings on those recent rental trends with a sense of welcome surprise. As a result, I take some comfort that the effects of the proposal on local rental supply won't be as significant as I'd originally anticipated, simply due to there being less, you know, the local rental supply being less constrained than I'd understood it to be. Notwithstanding this, I still am unconvinced that the proposal's relationship with housing is appropriate through a policy lens. So in particular, I consider that it's important we keep in mind the comprehensive residential development pathway that this development has followed to date. And I note that those comprehensive residential rules introduced under Plan Change 19 allow for certain compromises on usual standards. And they do this as a way to promote development that delivers on the zone's primary purpose, which is to provide for housing and housing diversity. I know the applicant's gone to some lengths to describe the developer's historic intent for the site to be a hotel or motel. And as I've outlined in my report, this was never formally applied for nor assessed by council. But the point I'd like to make is, had it of been, then that development would never have been considered under the comprehensive residential development framework. And really the overall yield of such a proposal would have been determined by factors such as urban design and inevitably parking. In this context, I continue to hold strong reservations about the appropriateness of multi-unit development being consented through that comprehensive residential development pathway, only to then be tied up as visitor accommodation. Has any questions up to this point, Commissioners, or would you like me to carry on?
Just in relation to that last point, it's still the applicant's prerogative to have visitor accommodation assessed on its merits, is it not? Even though it's what you're saying to us, I think, is it might have been assessed differently. That it's a very theoretical sort of assumption, but we need to consider it what's in front of us now on its merits, and we will ask you some questions on. Just as an observation more than the question, really, but they are entitled to have it assessed. And
absolutely, they are entitled to have it assessed and have it assessed as a discretionary activity. And I guess the point I'm making, as a discretionary activity, the discretion is open to considering this broader planning context, and it's my opinion that background is quite relevant when considering the appropriateness of this development. This development, not this site, is a point I'd like to make there as well, you know, because what I'm saying, I'm not saying anything here about the appropriateness or not of this site for the proposed activity. I'm making a point about the appropriateness of this approved development being used for the proposed activity, because it is essentially a change of use application.
What we would like you to do though is to make a comment on whether what we would like you to give us advice on is this a suitable site for visitor accommodation, bearing in mind the factors that have been put to us in evidence about its proximity to the township, the underpass, the commercial facility next door, and the special nature of the Worming Tree development. Is it a suitable site from a planning point of view for visitor accommodation as a general proposition, do you think?
As a general proposition, yeah, from a planning point of view, for all those mentioned reasons, I think it has planning merit as a visitor accommodation site. Equally, it has very strong planning merit as a comprehensive residential development site, which, you know, again, the planning framework for that kind of development, you know, seeks sites with a lot of those same characteristics in terms of connectiveness, yes, and all the rest of it. So,
understood. Yes. Right.
Yes.
All right, that's answered. Thank you. Yeah. Please carry on. Yeah. Questions?
Sorry if you don't mind bearing with me. I'm just flicking through my notes, seeing we've sort of jumped ahead and covered some of the things.
I can ask you questions if it helps, Mr. McIntosh. Yeah, are you going to come to the objectives and policies? We're interested in your any different sort of perspectives you might have on the main policies and objectives, which are not apparently specific to visitor accommodation, though they're not necessarily exclusive. You know, we had some evidence on that. Did you have any further comments to make on those? Mr. Duffy's evidence on that.
I suppose only quite a general statement that, you know, where you have a plan allowing activities like this as a discretionary activity without very explicit policy direction, I think that what am I getting at here? That it's not explicit in an enabling sense as well as in a avoidance sense. So what the policy framework is explicit around is the medium density residential zone being primarily for housing and housing diversity. And I think that's the starting point. That's the lens through which any other activity needs to be considered, unless it does have a more pointed, you know, policy directly addressing it.
Mr. McIntosh, just on that, I note that the objective 01, while the primary objective is for intensive residential living, there's a clause while allowing activities that support and are compatible with. So are you saying that while, how do you interpret the word while in that clause?
Well,
I think it's as well as, not while. This objective one.
I'm just reading from Ollie's report.
Oh, okay.
The actual objective is different.
I think we might be. Sorry, what?
Yeah, I've got it, the district plan in front of me. So if I said while in my report, I can confirm that the wording is primarily for more intensive residential living opportunities, as well as activities that support and are compatible with the zone's residential focus.
Right. So as well as. So how do you interpret the words as well as? Thank you for noting the correction.
I interpret that as you know, the plan anticipates a range of other activities being appropriate within the zone in support of the primary objectives of the zone being housing. But that, you know, there's inevitably a large amount of discretion left there for the likes of all of us in the room today to consider whether or not the proposed activities are indeed supporting and compatible with the zone's residential focus. As I've outlined in my 42A report, it's my position that, you know, this doesn't. And again, it's my submission that taking a broader look at the development pathway that this has followed is relevant here, because we have a development that has come about through that comprehensive residential development framework, ostensibly to, well, not ostensibly, it has very clearly been delivering on the primary purposes of the zone. Now, this proposal potentially flips that quite significantly in taking those approved units, 100% of the approved units on this site, and allowing them to be used for a different purpose. So it's my position that
Mr. McIntosh, I've just
through that
noticed that
context,
you've just
Sorry.
used the words in my submission and it's my position. And it's really careful. We need to be really careful on which basis you are presenting this evidence to us. Are you presenting as an expert planner?
I am.
We're not presenting submissions,
My
are you?
apologies. No.
Thank you.
Just another
In
question.
my opinion, should have been perhaps what I said there.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just wanted to explore one thing with you, Mr. McIntosh, the concept that you talk about the site, and that's the site in question, it's 46 units. But we've been asked to consider it in the context of the wider Worming Tree development as being a bigger site, if you like, even though it's not a certificate of title. And so it's been presented to us in a way that the 46 units is a fraction of the total housing supply that's been provided, and we should view it in that context. Is that an attractive, is that an argument that's valid, do you think, or do you still maintain we should look at this in isolation to the rest of Worming Tree, planning point of view?
I think that's somewhat of a slippery slope to do when you have a larger development that that would be a straightforward proposition had this been proposed and being considered in the context of the wider subdivision, the wider estate development. It's not. So I think that wider context is really only relevant insofar as it's obviously part of the receiving environment. The area surrounding this site is residential. It is being developed as residential. It is delivering on primarily housing. Or I don't dispute any of that. That's the receiving environment this is in. I just think it.
And so I guess just to follow up on that, the master planning concept, the fact that the master plan has no status in a planning sense, but it's been put to us that it informs the residents who live in the area, and it's been earmarked, I think the word was used. Is that a 1041C other matter that we should put some weight on? It's been put to us that we should. So it's not a random residential suburb. It has been planned to a degree, not considered through a consenting pathway by council to date, but it's nevertheless been signalled to the people that live in the Worming Tree area that that's what's intended. Is that something that puts it above other run-of-the-mill type developments, do you think?
I'd be very careful about that, and I think if the panel accept it as a 104C matter, then I guess my next point would be that I don't think it carries much weight in that sense. The reality is, while the developer may have had that intent from early on, and indeed some of the fast track plans have the site labelled for that potential use, I think I outline in my 42A report in the background section. I've included there an extract from the fast track consent with an advice note that has, I would say quite deliberately taken the step of saying that any notations of visitor accommodation on lot 604 referred to in the master plan, concept plans, etc., reflect possible future use activities for aircraft on these lots. These users have not been granted through this consent. So
isn't that just making it crystal clear that that's not been consented? Is it not intending to do anything more than that?
Well, that's right. But I guess if what we're getting at is, this brings me back to the weight. So that context may be, valid context to take into consideration, but really what weight does that carry? I certainly, were I somebody doing my due diligence and buying into that development, wouldn't read any of that and assume that that's in any way a guaranteed outcome for that site.
Okay, understood. I'm not sure if you've still got things to tell us, but have you got anything else that that you haven't covered yet?
Perhaps just very quickly to touch on precedent plan integrity, that
yes,
side of things.
Right. Thank you.
And again, I've labored on this point a bit, but it is my opinion that the key precedent and integrity concerns arise from the consenting pathway this is taken. That if developments granted through the comprehensive residential development provisions are allowed to subsequently be utilised as large-scale visitor accommodation facilities, then it's in my opinion, it is likely that other proposals will follow suit, and that in doing so, this would, in my opinion, quite clearly undermine the purpose and intent of those provisions. So I think, this is probably somewhat tied to your earlier questions around the earmarking of this site.
And it sort of raises the question about, you've accepted it's a discretionary activity, but you have your concerns about precedent, the scale of it, as I'm picking up now, I think, is the scale of this activity would set a precedent for similar scale activities to occur, maybe not smaller ones to occur, because the zone must envisage it happening, must it not? Because even though it's not explicitly stated in the objectives, it's still a discretionary activity. And it's very hard to argue that it's an unintended outcome to have visitor accommodation in the zone. Would that be a fair proposition? So your precedent arguments must be limited to the scale of this activity, is that right?
Absolutely. I think I'm definitely not saying the plan doesn't anticipate visitor accommodation occurring within the zone in some form. I guess what I'm saying is getting a comprehensive residential development approved for 46 lots, 46 units, and then having all 46 of those units be used for visitor accommodation isn't compatible with or in keeping with the zone's residential focus.
That's not a precedent argument. You're talking there about the objectives and policies, aren't you, really? Is that right? Yeah, but it's not a precedent argument. Was it?
The precedent is in the consent pathway. So my concerns specifically around conversion of comprehensive. My precedent concern is specifically around the conversion of comprehensive residential developments.
I see. Thanks for clarifying that. That's useful. We're going to come to conditions now, unless you have some other high level things to say, Mr. McIntosh. But...
No, by all means.
Okay, so you've already, thank you. You've already addressed the spillover issue and through conditions, the reserve or other development contributions aspect, the lack of an on-site manager. I'm just going over to my colleague in case there's any further particular questions about conditions. But, okay, I'll just have a quick look myself. So the additional conditions tracked and read by Mr. Duffy, amplified music restraint, some minor editing changes, signs, commercial signs, and you've already raised the issue of question 19, the operator, what does that mean? Does the consent relate to? Another one about change of ownership, condition 21, notify council of that. Is there any other aspects of the changes to conditions you wish to address us on? But pretty well covered it.
Nothing substantively that's not already been covered in evidence or in questions. I just perhaps add, and I think it has already been raised, that that manager, ideally it should be an on-site manager is my opinion, but should we head down consent as it's been proposed and that's an off-site manager, then I definitely support a condition reinforcing that management be a local entity.
Thank you. Make a note of that. Okay. Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have, and thanks very much for answering our detailed questions on that. What I think we'll do now is take an adjournment, and then commissioners will discuss where we think we're at. But when we come back, interested in, I guess, the response verbally to those things, and we'll need to decide whether we'd like more work to be done in terms of conditions, whether that's a realistic outcome for us. But we'll initially hear from you. We'll come back. I guess we'll make our lunch break. So, is half an hour suitable for lunch? Is that long enough for people? Would you like a bit longer than that? Yeah. Going
It's fine.
Half an hour. Well, if we come back at say 1 o'clock and reconvene then. Thank you very much.
Commissioners, can I just ask, would you like Mr. Collins to stay online available for the end of this? Or
I think it would be good if you come back, Mr. Collins, at 1 o'clock, and we'll discuss anything to do with traffic straight away. First up, yeah, and then you might be able to go. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you.
Look, Mr. McGrath's gone. That's fine. As mentioned, he's not required any further. And thank you. Reconvene the hearing. Thanks, Mr. McIntosh and Mr. Collins for being on. Yeah, we have the luncheon break, and I guess the next stage is, rather than have a verbal substantive issues, I don't think you're intending to do that, will you? We asked for a written reply, due course.
Yes, sir. What I was going to propose is that perhaps we take this opportunity to workshop a couple of the conditions, which we've done over the break. So come back to you on our train of thought on where we would adjust, based upon the comments from
workshop within your teams, you mean?
With you. And we're going to work through
okay.
Which ones will change and where we've landed on that and why. So I think that'll give you a clear picture of the applicant's position.
Sure.
And then I'd propose that we just have a short kind of summary response to some key issues and then defer substantive matters to reply in writing.
That's fine. Yeah, we'll see how that goes. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Very good.
So in terms of the applicant's position on conditions, we've considered some of the feedback and worked through where those could probably be adjusted. So starting with condition 4, we had the suggestion of including a timeframe for certification. We accept that, and we propose that that would be within 20 working days for council certification. In terms of the operator versus owner inconsistency, we will do a word search and ensure that those are consistent throughout.
I think it's the operator.
Yeah.
It'll be operating.
Yeah, I think so, but we'll check that.
Right, okay, there'll be one term and you'll tell us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Condition 10, we had a question around there being only one group per booking and how that could be enforced or made a little bit more certain, but we think that it already is as certain as it can probably get, and the requirement that a booking is through the single property manager, I think effectively reinforces that it would be a clear breach to rent it out to more than one group at a time. So we don't currently propose to change that one. Condition 17 around a designated on-call manager should be available 24 hours per day to respond to complaints. We are also willing to volunteer that on-call manager must be based within the Cromwell area. So we'll prescribe that in a consent condition just to ensure that the person is, on site and readily available to respond to issues. In terms of condition 19, whether it should be a complaints record by the operator or the body corporate or the property manager, what we think we will clarify there is that that's the property manager who's required to maintain the record, and they shall provide a copy of that record to the operator. Well, so that's already also contained within the VAM requirements for the property managers, but it's just a matter of confirming that and making it applicable to the operators as well through that condition. We also noted a concern about the how it was prescribed that there shall be one property manager. So that is contained within the condition 5B, where it says the manager shall be the same person / organisation for all units. But take the point that perhaps that could just be its own condition rather than sitting as a purpose or objective to contain within the site management plan.
Right, because these
So-
conditions include purposes as well, don't they?
Yeah, so and which is common, how you might sort of contain objectives to be certified in a subsequent plan. So I think that should just be its own consent condition. Then we talked about volunteering the mobility parking condition. So what we will draft there is the allocation of 4 prescribed parks on that master plan for allocation by the property manager to be used for accessible parking needs.
Yeah, if they'd be marked in some way.
They'll be denoted on the
Okay.
plans and the conditions of consent, the particular ones, the 4.
Yes, but they wouldn't have the standard mobility so that the public don't think it's right there, but they would be identified as under the control of the property manager, and people would be told these are the car parks to come to because they are suitable for people who have access limitations.
To discourage people just using them randomly, to be something. Yeah.
Yes, that like all parks will be labelled that it's only if allocated.
And then we reflected on the concerns around whether the consent holder is one entity or subsequently runs with the land and is sort of owned by multiple property owners. our understanding is that, as with any land use consent, the right runs with the land and the
Yeah.
obligations also therefore flow to those, individual owners as well. But in practice, the consent conditions are structured such that the operation or the benefits of the consent must be, run in a collective way. And that's through the requirement to have one on-site property manager, to have, the letting pool requirements, the consistent visitor accommodation management plan, etc. So there is a collective nature to the consent, but
What role does a body court have in it at all? If any, there is a body court, is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Does that have any role in it?
So I think if the council ran into difficulties and wanted to prosecute some or take enforcement action against somebody, they would do that. I suggest to you that they should be able to do that against the individual owner who had infringed it. And obviously the property manager is required, or the body corporate, being a corporation, is required to appoint a property manager and run it in accordance with this consent. So the body corporate would probably also be in default for failing to manage the consent in the way required.
Right. So if you can make it clear the hierarchy, that the consent holder would still be, it's just my thoughts at the moment. The consent holder would be RW Cromwell Limited. That's who the consent would be granted to. And then the conditions relate to individual operators who are, and the way the body court fits into it is they're responsible for the property manager. The property manager, there's operators that have got requirements on them. And council, if it wishes to enforce anything, would do it through the property manager, wouldn't they? Because RW Cromwell would cease to have an involvement in it down the track. Is that right?
Yes.
If I got that right, I mean, I'm just talking
Pretty
about.
close. There's going to end up being 46 people who own a consent.
Yeah, they are. Yes.
Which is that. But to exercise their consent,
Yeah.
they have to do it in a collaborative approach through the appointment of the property manager administered through the body corporate. So it would be a situation where if somebody was in default, that would be, that would be the accountability of both the 146 property owner, but as well as the property manager / body corporate for failing to manage the consent in accordance with the conditions.
We'll need to review what comes in on that, I guess. And we'll also, I'll let you continue. You haven't quite finished yet.
I haven't got finished, but we can
All right.
provide more
Sorry.
context
Yeah.
on that in the reply.
Okay.
And then the final point is this, is the monitoring concept of parking. So we've taken on board some of the suggestions and some of the feedback, and we've workshopped how we could provide for the options. Where we've landed is that a further specific review and monitoring condition would be offered.
Yes.
Do you want to walk through?
Yes, and so what we envisage is, say, 12 months, or pick whatever the time slot you want, but there would be a report provided to the council, a monitoring report provided to the council by the property manager, which would set out the units that have opted into the scheme, the usage of those units, and a full set of the complaints. And that would then give all parties, including the council, the ability to identify issues. Like there could be complaints because the builders working in Queenstown and wanting there and rented the place for 6 months were the ones that were parking in the street. But you'd be able to allocate the complaints about what was happening in the street versus were the units available for visitor accommodation. It would give you the best opportunity to identify if it was. The only other way would be then to put cameras on individual doorways in the units, and that just seemed inappropriate in the New Zealand privacy laws. And, it's envisaging a level of problem which is way beyond what happens. Now, if there's huge issues going forward, then obviously you could escalate it to that level of specificity, but the suggestion, in my view, if you did it like that, you would get enough information to be able to issue, is there a problem or not? And if there is a problem, then you can you can require the property manager to deal with it.
So that would be there's a section, I'm just trying to find it, section 128. Oh, there it is. Condition 22 is the present. So that's a general.
Yes, that would be a separate
Specific
condition.
one.
Yeah,
Does it sit separately and have more specific purpose and more
Yes.
methodology?
Yep.
Right.
your 128 would still sit there as your ultimate backstop.
Yeah.
But we suggesting we offer you a 21A for one of a term, but a specific condition on this aspect.
Right. Okay, I think I picked up the main thrust of that. Yeah, and that's questions. Yes.
That's it.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll have a short break when you're finished doing a response to discuss that and come back.
Okay, that would be helpful.
Because the first sort of thought with that is that we would ask the officers to potentially respond to that. So we've got their view on it as well before we call for quite a reply. But I'll discuss it with my colleague. But in the interest of fairness, we probably look for the news as well. They'll be looking at the wording and any potential implications of that, and also to give you time to do it properly, not to give us something right now. It'd be useful that you've only had half an hour plus lunch.
Yeah. So as part of the written reply, I'd propose that we do a markup set of what we just discussed and provide that to you.
Well, yeah. What I was I'll discuss it with my colleague. But what I was thinking was in a process in between where there's a bit of feedback from officers before you do the right reply, because ideally that should be the last step. Yeah. We'll have a quick chat about that soon.
Okay, then, and so that's all of the applicants' sort of legal and evidential case that you've heard. I could run through the matters that I have jotted down that I'll provide in reply if that would assist. Or else you can.
I think keep that for the written reply. I'm pretty sure we understand your case. It's been put and we understand the evidence. So there's probably no merit right now on going through that.
Okay.
But curtail you. But I think we understand that. Our key focus now will be on what's the next step before we get to the. Unless there's anything that is new that you wish to say to us, or anything that hasn't been emphasised enough, I shouldn't curtail that.
I don't think there's anything new, but I think that my one observation after hearing from the Section 42A author was that a lot of the focus of concern seemed to be more about precedent of the consenting pathway rather than effects per se.
Yes.
And I'm not aware of case law about when precedent concerns are applied to a consent pathway rather than a concern about effects being replicated in future, like proposals. So I can check that. But my one observation on that was that, as we discussed, PC19, could have kind of restricted that outcome to a greater degree and hasn't elected to do so. And furthermore, as I opened this morning, the recent granting of the comprehensive residential development consent equally could have constrained that future application by way of consent notice conditions. And I referred to the fast track proposal, which elected to do so in respect of particular retail activities because of concerns and evidence presented around those future effects in this case. And when I take you back to that 2025 consent granted under the CRD framework, and it's included by way of context in the application itself, it doesn't appear that that was a particular concern in the processing of the consent. And finally, I just observed that perhaps I'm not sure to what end this matters, because if the report writer's ultimate conclusion is that there is an acceptance based upon the economic evidence that there is no material adverse effect on housing supply, in the case of this proposal, then I'm not sure to what end, there is a particular concern about the CRD pathway as a matter of sort of planning history, rather than focusing on the effects of this consent.
Understanding point, I just observed that I also picked up another concern about the pathway was what I think Mr. McIntosh said to us was that if it had been done at the same time, it might have led to a different outcome with parking. I picked up, and we'll go back and listen to the tape, but it might have led to a more rigorous approach to parking. That's what I heard. I'm not sure. But
I wonder if that's because of the literal reading of the rules and the visitor accommodation rules triggering that parking requirement for one space per bedroom, or
anyway,
the higher parking requirement rather than the residential.
We'll think about that more once we've heard the tape, but you're welcome to address that in the right reply.
Yeah, I will. Yeah. One other observation I did here in that was Mr. McIntosh saying that there are trade-offs as well considered in respect of the CRD pathway, and in light of it being an enabling sort of housing development, there are trade-offs. But when I read that decision from October 2025, I don't see that as particularly being the case. To me, it looked like an assessment based upon appropriate urban form and design outcomes in the context. And I'm not sure that the trade-offs, so to speak, or I'm not sure what they were, or that it was so demonstrably different from the anticipated outcomes of the NDR zone.
Okay. So, look, I'm glad you raised that, because those things you mentioned have always sort of raised as not new things, but we certainly have discussion on it. So you've given us pause to think about that before the reply comes in. Thank you very much. Reconvene. Didn't take too long, but just to conclude that. So what I think we'll do, or what we will do, is we'll ask the applicant's team to come up with a revised set of proposed conditions based on what you've just gone through us with. We're particularly interested, as part of the fair process, we would send those to the officers and Mr. Collins to comment on, but it would probably be efficient if, in compiling those conditions, you had some liaison with the officers, in particular the monitoring condition, because Mr. Collins is the one who suggested that. So if you're able to liaise with him before it comes to us, that will make the process more efficient. But in any event, we'll send it to them, the officers, for any formal comment. Then we'll invite the reply. So it's not a formal joint witness thing, but it would be useful to collaborate and refine those conditions as best you can. And it could also be with Mr. McIntosh on those other matters, or you might wish to liaise with him on the wording of some of those conditions as well. But ultimately, do you think that might take you 2 weeks or something of that nature, or a couple of weeks?
So should we say full 2 weeks, or end of next week?
Just end of tomorrow.
So maybe all of that liaising, how about it's provided at the either Thursday 14th or Friday 15th?
Yep, and that's what we're intending. Mr. Colin, would you be available if contacted within the next 2 weeks, within the next week or so, to make any comment? Would you be available?
Yes, I'm available, and Mr. Langwell's got my contact details.
Okay, that's good. So we're just trying to make it an efficient process. We will give the officers a chance to comment formally, but if you make any suggestions during the next 2 weeks, that will simplify the matter. If you did get to a point where you totally agreed, then obviously it would save time if you were to sign off, but we don't expect that to necessarily be the case. So.
Okay. And then should we say perhaps a further week for the full written reply? So Friday the 22nd?
Yes. Okay. We can issue a formal minute on that tomorrow, just to formalise that. And that'll be it basically. And all for the right of reply, and then we'll hopefully be in a position to close the hearing. So other than that, I don't think there's anything else to say, but thank you everyone. We'll conclude the hearing now on that basis. Thank you to the officers for staying online, and appreciate your input. Appreciate everyone's input. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Unihia ki te uru tapu nei, kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara tangata. Hoia rā e rongo, pakairea aki ki runga, ia tina, huie, tai.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioners.
Thank you.
Thank you.